Chapter 30 of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. 1. Fern Mullins rushed into the house on a Saturday morning, early in September, and shrieked at Carol, "School starts next Tuesday. I've got to have one more spree before I'm arrested. Let's get up a picnic down the lake for this afternoon. Won't you come, Mrs. Kennicott, and the doctor? Cy Bogart wants to go. He's a brat, but he's lively." "I don't think the doctor can go," sedately. "He said something about having to make a country call this afternoon, but I'd love to." "That's dandy. Who can we get?" "Mrs. Dyer might be chaperone. She's been so nice. And maybe Dave, if he could get away from the store." "How about Eric Valborg? I think he's got lots more style than these town boys. You like him all right, don't you?" So the picnic of Carol, Fern, Eric, Cy Bogart, and the Dyers was not only moral, but inevitable. They drove to the birch grove on the south shore of Lake Minniemashie. Dave Dyer was his most clownish self. He yelped, jigged, wore Carol's hat, dropped an ant down Fern's back, and when they went swimming, the women modestly changing in the car with the side curtains up, the men undressing behind the bushes, constantly repeating, "Gee, hope we don't run into poison ivy," Dave splashed water in them and dived to clutch his wife's ankle. He infected the others. Eric gave an imitation of the Greek dancers he had seen in vaudeville. And when they sat down to picnic supper spread on a laprobe on the grass, Cy climbed a tree to throw acorns at them. But Carol could not frolic. She had made herself young, with parted hair, sailor blouse and large blue bow, white canvas shoes, and a short linen skirt. Her mirror had asserted that she looked exactly as she had in college, that her throat was smooth, her collarbone not very noticeable. But she was under restraint. When they swam, she enjoyed the freshness of the water, but she was irritated by Cy's tricks, by Dave's excessive good spirits. She admired Eric's dance. He could never betray bad taste, as Cy did and Dave. She waited for him to come to her. He did not come. By his joyousness he had apparently endeared himself to the Dyers. Maud watched him, and, after supper, cried to him, "Come sit down beside me, bad boy." Carol winced at his willingness to be a bad boy and come and sit, at his enjoyment of a not very stimulating game in which Maud, Dave, and Cy snatched slices of cold tongue from one another's plates. Maud, it seemed, was slightly dizzy from the swim. She remarked publicly, "Dr. Kennicott has helped me so much by putting me on a diet." But it was to Eric alone that she gave the complete version of her peculiarity in being so sensitive, so easily hurt by the slightest cross word, that she simply had to have nice, cheery friends. Eric was nice and cheery. Carol assured herself, "What faults I may have, I certainly couldn't ever be jealous. I do like Maud, she's always so pleasant. But I wonder if she isn't just a bit fond of fishing for men's sympathy. Playing with Eric, and her married. Well. But she looks at him in that languishing, swooning, mid-Victorian way. Disgusting." Cy Bogart lay between the roots of a big birch, smoking his pipe and teasing Fern, assuring her that a week from now, when he was again a high school boy and she his teacher, he'd wink at her in class. Maud Dyer wanted Eric to come down to the beach to see the darling little Minnies. Carol was left to Dave, who tried to entertain her with humorous accounts of Ella Stowbody's fondness for chocolate peppermints. She watched Maud Dyer put her hand on Eric's shoulder to steady herself. Disgusting, she thought. Cy Bogart covered Fern's nervous hand with his red paw, and when she bounced with half anger and shrieked, "Let go, I tell you," he grinned and waved his pipe, a gangling 20-year-old satyr. Disgusting. When Maud and Eric returned and the group shifted, Eric muttered at Carol, "There's a boat on shore. Let's skip off and have a row." What will they think? She worried. She saw Maud Dyer peer at Eric with moist, possessive eyes. "Yes, let's," she said. She cried to the party, with the canonical amount of sprightliness, Goodbye, everybody. We'll wireless you from China." As the rhythmic oars plopped and creaked, as she floated on an unreality of delicate gray over which the sunset was poured out thin, the irritation of Cy and Maud slipped away. Eric smiled at her proudly. She considered him, coatless, in white thin shirt. She was conscious of his male differentness, of his flat masculine sides, his thin thighs, his easy rowing. They talked of the library, of the movies. He hummed, and she softly sang "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." A breeze shivered across the agate lake. The wrinkled water was like armor, damascened and polished. The breeze flowed round the boat in a chill current. Carol drew the collar of her middy blouse over her bare throat. "Getting cold. Afraid we'll have to go back," she said. "Let's not go back to them yet. They'll be cutting up. Let's keep along the shore." "But you enjoy the cutting up. Maud and you had a beautiful time." "Why, we just walked on the shore and talked about fishing." She was relieved and apologetic to her friend Maud. "Of course. I was joking. I'll tell you. Let's land here and sit on the shore. That bunch of hazel brush will shelter us from the wind, and watch the sunset. It's like melted lead. Just a short while. We don't want to go back and listen to them." "No, but—" She said nothing while he sped ashore. The keel clashed on the stones. He stood on the forward seat, holding out his hand. They were alone, in the ripple-lapping silence. She rose slowly stepped over the water in the bottom of the old boat. She took his hand confidently. Unspeaking, they sat on a bleached log, in a russet sunset which hinted of autumn. Linden leaves fluttered about them. "I wish— Are you cold now?" he whispered. "A little." She shivered, but it was not with cold. "I wish we could curl up in the leaves there, covered all up, and lie looking out at the dark." "I wish we could," as though it was comfortably understood that he did not mean to be taken seriously. "Like what all the poets say, brown nymph and fawn." "No, I can't be a nymph any more. Too old. Eric, am I old? Am I faded and small-towny?" "Why, you're the youngest. Your eyes are like a girl's. They're so— well, I mean, like you believed everything. Even if you do teach me, I feel 1,000 years older than you, instead of maybe a year younger. 4 or 5 years younger. Anyway, your eyes are so innocent and your cheeks so soft. Damn it, it makes me want to cry somehow. You're so defenseless. And I want to protect you, and there's nothing to protect you against." "Am I young? Am I? Honestly? Truly?" She betrayed for a moment the childish, mock-imploring tone that comes into the voice of the most serious woman when an agreeable man treats her as a girl. The childish tone and childish, pursed-up lips and shy lift of the cheek. "Yes, you are." "You're dear to believe it, Will, Eric." "Will you play with me, a lot?" "Perhaps." "Would you really like to curl up in the leaves and watch the stars swing by overhead?" "I think it's rather better to be sitting here." He twined his fingers with hers. "And Eric, we must go back." "Why?" "It's somewhat late to outline all the history of social custom." "I know. We must." "Are you glad we ran away, though?" "Yes." She was quiet, perfectly simple, but she rose. He circled her waist with a brusque arm. She did not resist. She did not care. He was neither a peasant tailor, a potential artist, a social complication, nor a peril. He was himself, and in him, in the personality flowing from him, she was unreasonably content. In his nearness she caught a new view of his head. The last light brought out the planes of his neck, his flat, ruddy cheeks, the side of his nose, the depression of his temples. Not as coy or uneasy lovers, but as companions they walked to the boat, and he lifted her up on the prow. She began to talk intently as he rowed. "Eric, you've got to work. You ought to be a personage. You're robbed of your kingdom. Fight for it. Take one of these correspondence courses in drawing. They mayn't be any good in themselves, but they'll make you try to draw, and—" As they reached the picnic ground, she perceived that it was dark, that they had been gone for a long time. What will they say? She wondered. The others greeted them with the inevitable storm of humor and slight vexation. "Where the deuce do you think you've been?" "You're a fine pair, you are." Eric and Carol looked self-conscious, failed in their effort to be witty. All the way home, Carol was embarrassed. Once Cy winked at her. That Cy, the peeping Tom of the garage loft, should consider her a fellow sinner. She was furious and frightened and exultant by turns, and in all her moods certain that Kennicott would read her adventuring in her face. She came into the house awkwardly defiant. Her husband, half asleep under the lamp, greeted her. "Well, well, have a nice time?" She could not answer. He looked at her, but his look did not sharpen. He began to wind his watch, yawning the old, "Well, guess it's about time to turn in." That was all. Yet she was not glad. She was almost disappointed. 2. Mrs. Bogart called next day. She had a hen-like, crumb-pecking, diligent appearance. Her smile was too innocent. The pecking started instantly. "Cy says you had lots of fun at the picnic yesterday. Did you enjoy it?" "Oh, yes. I raced Cy at swimming. He beat me badly. He's so strong, isn't he?" "Poor boy. Just crazy to get into the war, too. But this Eric Valborg was along, wasn't he?" "Yes." "I think he's an awfully handsome fellow, and they say he's smart. Do you like him?" "He seems very polite." "Cy says you and him had a lovely boat ride. My, that must have been pleasant." "Yes, except that I couldn't get Mr. Valborg to say a word. I wanted to ask him about the suit Mr. Hicks is making for my husband, but he insisted on singing. Still, it was restful, floating around on the water and singing, so happy and innocent. Don't you think it's a shame, Mrs. Bogart, that people in this town don't do more nice, clean things like that, instead of all this horrible gossiping?" "Yes, yes." Mrs. Bogart sounded vacant. Her bonnet was awry. She was incomparably dowdy. Carol stared at her, felt contemptuous, ready at last to rebel against the trap, and as the rusty goodwife fished again, "Planning some more picnics?" she flung out. "I haven't the slightest idea. Oh, is that Hugh crying? I must run up to him." But upstairs she remembered that Mrs. Bogart had seen her walking with Eric from the railroad track into town, and she was chilly with disquietude. At the Jolly 17, 2 days after, she was effusive to Maud Dyer, to Juanita Haydock. She fancied that everyone was watching her, but she could not be sure, and in rare strong moments she did not care. She could rebel against the town's prying now that she had something, however indistinct, for which to rebel. In a passionate escape there must be not only a place from which to flee, but a place to which to flee. She had known that she would gladly leave Gopher Prairie, leave Main Street and all that it signified, but she had had no destination. She had one now. That destination was not Eric Valborg and the love of Eric. She continued to assure herself that she wasn't in love with him, but merely fond of him and interested in his success. Yet in him she had discovered both her need of youth and the fact that youth would welcome her. It was not Eric to whom she must escape, but universal and joyous youth, in classrooms, in studios, in offices, in meetings to protest against things in general, but universal and joyous youth rather resembled Eric. All week she thought of things she wished to say to him, high, improving things. She began to admit that she was lonely without him. Then she was afraid. It was at the Baptist church supper, a week after the picnic, that she saw him again. She had gone with Kennicott and Aunt Bessie to the supper, which was spread on oilcloth-covered and trestle-supported tables in the church basement. Eric was helping Myrtle Cass to fill coffee cups for the waitresses. The congregation had doffed their piety. Children tumbled under the tables, and Deacon Pearson greeted the women with a rolling, "Where's Brother Jones, sister? Where's Brother Jones? Not going to be with us tonight? Well, you tell Sister Perry to hand you a plate, and make 'em give you enough oyster pie." Eric shared in the cheerfulness. He laughed with Myrtle, jogged her elbow when she was filling cups, made deep mock bows to the waitresses as they came up for coffee. Myrtle was enchanted by his humor. From the other end of the room, a matron among matrons, Carol observed Myrtle and hated her, and caught herself at it. To be jealous of a wooden-faced village girl. But she kept it up. She detested Eric, gloated over his gaucheries, his breaks she called them. When he was too expressive, too much like a Russian dancer, in saluting Deacon Pearson, Carol had the ecstasy of pain in seeing the deacon sneer. When, trying to talk to 3 girls at once, he dropped a cup and effeminately wailed, "Oh, dear!" she sympathized with, and ached over, the insulting secret glances of the girls. From meanly hating him, she rose to compassion as she saw that his eyes begged every one to like him. She perceived how inaccurate her judgments could be. At the picnic, she had fancied that Maud Dyer looked upon Eric too sentimentally, and she had snarled, "I hate these married women who cheapen themselves and feed on boys." But at the supper, Maud was one of the waitresses. She bustled with platters of cake. She was pleasant to old women. And to Eric she gave no attention at all. Indeed, when she had her own supper, she joined the Kennicotts, and how ludicrous it was to suppose that Maud was a gourmet of emotions Carol saw in the fact that she talked not to one of the town beaux, but to the safe Kennicott himself. When Carol glanced at Eric again, she discovered that Mrs. Bogart had an eye on her. It was a shock to know that at last there was something which could make her afraid of Mrs. Bogart's spying. "What am I doing? Am I in love with Eric? Unfaithful? I want youth, but I don't want him. I mean, I don't want youth, enough to break up my life. I must get out of this, quick." She said to Kennicott on their way home, "Will, I want to run away for a few days. Wouldn't you like to skip down to Chicago?" "Still pretty hot there. No fun in a big city till winter. What do you want to go for?" "People, to occupy my mind. I want stimulus." "Stimulus?" He spoke good-naturedly. "Who's been feeding you meat? You got that stimulus out of one of these fool stories about wives that don't know when they're well off. Stimulus. Seriously, though, to cut out the jollying, I can't get away." "Then why don't I run off by myself?" "Why, 'tisn't the money, you understand. But what about Hugh?" "Leave him with Aunt Bessie. It would be just for a few days." "I don't much like this business of leaving kids around. Bad for 'em." "So you don't think—" "I'll tell you. I think we better stay put till after the war. Then we'll have a dandy long trip. No, I don't think you better plan much about going away now." So she was thrown at Eric. 3. She awoke at ebb time, at 3 of the morning, woke sharply and fully. And sharply and coldly as her father pronouncing sentence on a cruel swindler, she gave judgment. A pitiful and tawdry love affair. No splendor, no defiance. A self-deceived little woman whispering in corners with a pretentious little man. No, he is not. He is fine, aspiring. It's not his fault. His eyes are sweet when he looks at me. Sweet, so sweet. She pitied herself that her romance should be pitiful. She sighed that in this colorless hour, to this austere self, it should seem tawdry. then, in a very great desire of rebellion and unleashing of all her hatreds. The pettier and more tawdry it is, the more blame to Main Street. It shows how much I've been longing to escape. Any way out. Any humility so long as I can flee. Main Street has done this to me. I came here eager for nobilities, ready for work, and now, any way out. I came trusting them. They beat me with the rods of dullness. They don't know, they don't understand how agonizing their complacent dullness is, like ants in August sun on a wound. Tawdry, pitiful. Carol, the clean girl that used to walk so fast, sneaking and tittering in dark corners, being sentimental and jealous at church suppers. At breakfast time, her agonies were night-blurred and persisted only as a nervous irresolution. 4. Few of the aristocrats of the Jolly 17 attended the humble folk-meets of the Baptist and Methodist church suppers, where the Willis Woodfords, the Dillons, the Champ Perrys, Oleson the butcher, Brad Bemis the tinsmith, and Deacon Pearson found release from loneliness. But all of the smart set went to the lawn festivals of the Episcopal Church and were reprovingly polite to outsiders. The Harry Haydocks gave the last lawn festival of the season, a splendor of Japanese lanterns and card tables and chicken patties and Neapolitan ice cream. Eric was no longer entirely an outsider. He was eating his ice cream with a group of the people most solidly in, the Dyers, Myrtle Cass, Guy Pollock, the Jackson Elders. The Haydocks themselves kept aloof, but the others tolerated him. He would never, Carol fancied, be one of the town pillars, because he was not orthodox in hunting and motoring and poker. But he was winning approbation by his liveliness, his gaiety, the qualities least important in him. When the group summoned Carol, she made several very well-taken points in regard to the weather. Myrtle cried to Eric, "Come on, we don't belong with these old folks. I want to make you acquainted with the jolliest girl. She comes from Waukeman. She's staying with Mary Howland." Carol saw him being profuse to the guests from Waukeman. She saw him confidentially strolling with Myrtle. She burst out to Mrs. Westlake, "Valborg and Myrtle seem to have quite a crush on each other." Mrs. Westlake glanced at her curiously before she mumbled, "Yes, don't they?" "I'm mad to talk this way," Carol worried. She had regained a feeling of social virtue by telling Juanita Haydock how darling her lawn looked with the Japanese lanterns, when she saw that Eric was stalking her. Though he was merely ambling about with his hands in his pockets, though he did not peep at her, she knew that he was calling her. She sidled away from Juanita. Eric hastened to her. She nodded coolly. She was proud of her coolness. "Carol, I've got a wonderful chance. Don't know but what some ways it might be better than going east to take art. Myrtle Cass says, I dropped in to say howdy to Myrtle last evening and had quite a long talk with her father, and he said he was hunting for a fellow to go to work in the flour mill and learn the whole business, and maybe become general manager. I know something about wheat from my farming, and I worked a couple of months in the flour mill at Curlew when I got sick of tailoring. What do you think? You said any work was artistic if it was done by an artist, and flour is so important. What do you think?" Wait. This sensitive boy would be very skillfully stamped into conformity by Lyman Cass and his sallow daughter. But did she detest the plan for this reason? I must be honest. I mustn't tamper with his future to please my vanity. But she had no sure vision. She turned on him. "How can I decide? It's up to you. Do you want to become a person like Lyman Cass, or do you want to become a person like, yes, like me? Wait. Don't be flattering. Be honest. This is important." "I know. I am a person like you now. I mean, I want to rebel." "Yes, we're alike," gravely. "Only, I'm not sure I can put through my schemes. I really can't draw much. I guess I have pretty fair taste in fabrics, but since I've known you, I don't like to think about fussing with dress designing. But as a miller, I'd have the means: books, piano, travel. I'm going to be frank and beastly. Don't you realize that it isn't just because her papa needs a bright young man in the mill that Myrtle is amiable to you? Can't you understand what she'll do to you when she has you, when she sends you to church and makes you become respectable?" He glared at her. "I don't know. I suppose so." "You are thoroughly unstable." "What if I am? Most fish out of water are. Don't talk like Mrs. Bogart. How can I be anything but unstable? Wandering from farm to tailor shop to books, no training, nothing but trying to make books talk to me. Probably I'll fail. Oh, I know it. Probably I'm uneven. But I'm not unstable in thinking about this job in the mill and Myrtle. I know what I want. I want you." "Please, please, oh, please. I do. I'm not a schoolboy any more. I want you. If I take Myrtle, it's to forget you." "Please, please. It's you that are unstable. You talk at things and play at things, but you're scared. Would I mind it if you and I went off to poverty and I had to dig ditches? I would not. But you would. I think you would come to like me, but you won't admit it. I wouldn't have had to say this, but when you sneer at Myrtle and the mill, if I'm not to have good, sensible things like those, do you think I'll be content with trying to become a damn dressmaker after you? Are you fair? Are you?" "No, I suppose not." "Do you like me? Do you?" "Yes. No. Please. I can't talk any more." "Not here. Mrs. Haydock is looking at us." "No, nor anywhere." "Oh, Eric, I am fond of you, but I'm afraid." "What of?" "Of them. Of my rulers, Gopher Prairie. My dear boy, we are talking very foolishly. I am a normal wife and a good mother, and you are, oh, a college freshman. You do like me. I'm going to make you love me." She looked at him once, recklessly, and walked away with a serene gait that was a disordered flight. Kennicott grumbled on their way home. "You and this Valborg fellow seem quite chummy." "Oh, we are. He's interested in Myrtle Cass, and I was telling him how nice she is." In her room she marveled, "I have become a liar. I'm snarled with lies and foggy analyses and desires. I, who was clear and sure." She hurried into Kennicott's room, sat on the edge of his bed. He flapped a drowsy, welcoming hand at her from the expanse of quilt and dented pillows. "Will, I really think I ought to trot off to St. Paul or Chicago or someplace." "I thought we settled all that a few nights ago. Wait till we can have a real trip." He shook himself out of his drowsiness. "You might give me a good night kiss." She did, dutifully. He held her lips against his for an intolerable time. "Don't you like the old man any more?" he coaxed. He sat up and shyly fitted his palm about the slimness of her waist. "Of course, I like you very much indeed." Even to herself it sounded flat. She longed to be able to throw into her voice the facile passion of a light woman. She patted his cheek. He sighed. "I'm sorry you're so tired. Seems like... but of course you aren't very strong." "Yes. Then you don't think... you're quite sure I ought to stay here in town?" "I told you so. I certainly do." She crept back to her room, a small, timorous figure in white. "I can't face Will down, demand the right. He'd be obstinate. And I can't even go off and earn my living again. Out of the habit of it. He's driving me. I'm afraid of what he's driving me to. Afraid. That man in there, snoring in stale air, my husband. Could any ceremony make him my husband? No, I don't want to hurt him. I want to love him. I can't when I'm thinking of Eric. Am I too honest? A funny, topsy-turvy honesty, the faithfulness of the unfaith? I wish I had a more compartmental mind, like men. I'm too monogamous. Toward Eric. My child Eric, who needs me. Is an illicit affair like a gambling debt? Demands stricter honor than the legitimate debt of matrimony because it's not legally enforced? That's nonsense. I don't care in the least for Eric. Not for any man. I want to be let alone, in a woman world, a world without Main Street, or politicians, or businessmen, or men with that sudden beastly hungry look, that glistening unfrank expression that wives know. If Eric were here, if he would just sit quiet and kind and talk, I could be still, I could go to sleep. I am so tired. If I could sleep. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31, Of Main Street, by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Their night came unheralded. Kennicott was on a country call. It was cool, but Carol huddled on the porch, rocking, meditating, rocking. The house was lonely and repellent, and though she sighed, "I ought to go in and read. So many things to read. Ought to go in," she remained. Suddenly, Eric was coming, turning in, swinging open the screen door, touching her hand. "Eric." "Saw your husband driving out of town. Couldn't stand it." "Well, you mustn't stay more than 5 minutes." "Couldn't stand not seeing you. Every day towards evening, felt I had to see you. Picture you so clear. I've been good, though, staying away, haven't I?" "And you must go on being good." "Why must I?" "We better not stay here on the porch. The Howlands across the street are such window peepers, and Mrs. Bogart." She did not look at him, but she could divine his tremulousness as he stumbled indoors. A moment ago the night had been coldly empty. Now it was incalculable, hot, treacherous. But it is women who are the calm realists once they discard the fetishes of the premarital hunt. Carol was serene as she murmured, "Hungry? I have some little honey-colored cakes. You may have 2, and then you must skip home." "Take me up and let me see Hugh asleep." "I don't believe, just a glimpse." "Well." She doubtfully led the way to the hall-room nursery. Their heads close, Eric's curls pleasant as they touched her cheek, they looked in at the baby. Hugh was pink with slumber. He had burrowed into his pillow with such energy that it was almost smothering him. Beside it was a celluloid rhinoceros. Tied in his hand, a torn picture of old King Cole. "Shh," said Carol, quite automatically. She tiptoed in to pat the pillow. As she returned to Eric, she had a friendly sense of his waiting for her. They smiled at each other. She did not think of Kennicott, the baby's father. What she did think was that someone rather like Eric, an older and surer Eric, ought to be Hugh's father. The 3 of them would play incredible, imaginative games. "Carol, you've told me about your own room. Let me peep in at it." "But you mustn't stay, not a second. We must go downstairs." "Yes." "Will you be good?" "Reasonably." He was pale, large-eyed, serious. "You've got to be more than reasonably good." She felt sensible and superior. She was energetic about pushing open the door. Kennicott had always seemed out of place there, but Eric surprisingly harmonized with the spirit of the room as he stroked the books, glanced at the prints. He held out his hands. He came toward her. She was weak, betrayed to a warm softness. Her head was tilted back. Her eyes were closed. Her thoughts were formless but many-colored. She felt his kiss, diffident and reverent, on her eyelid. Then she knew that it was impossible. She shook herself. She sprang from him. "Please," she said sharply. He looked at her unyielding. "I am fond of you," she said. "Don't spoil everything. Be my friend." How many thousands and millions of women must have said that? And now you. And it doesn't spoil everything. It glorifies everything. Dear, I do think there's a tiny streak of fairy in you, whatever you do with it. Perhaps I'd have loved that once, but I won't. It's too late. But I'll keep a fondness for you. Impersonal. I will be impersonal. It needn't be just a thin, talky fondness. You do need me, don't you? Only you and my son need me. I've wanted so to be wanted. Once I wanted love to be given to me. Now I'll be content if I can give... almost content. We women, we like to do things for men. Poor men. We swoop on you when you're defenseless and fuss over you and insist on reforming you. But it's so pitifully deep in us. You'll be the one thing in which I haven't failed. Do something definite, even if it's just selling cottons. Sell beautiful cottons, caravans from China. Carol, stop. You do love me. I do not. It's just... Can't you understand? Everything crushes in on me so, all the gaping dull people, and I look for a way out. Please go. I can't stand any more. Please. He was gone, and she was not relieved by the quiet of the house. She was empty, and the house was empty, and she needed him. She wanted to go on talking, to get this threshed out, to build a sane friendship. She wavered down to the living room, looked out of the bay window. He was not to be seen. But Mrs. Westlake was. She was walking past, and in the light from the corner arc lamp she quickly inspected the porch, the windows. Carol dropped the curtain, stood with movement and reflection paralyzed. Automatically, without reasoning, she mumbled, "I will see him again soon, and make him understand we must be friends. But the house is so empty. It echoes so." 2. Kennicott had seemed nervous and absent-minded through that supper hour 2 evenings after. He prowled about the living room, then growled, "What the dickens have you been saying to Ma Westlake?" Carol's book rattled. "What do you mean?" "I told you that Westlake and his wife were jealous of us, and here you've been chumming up to them, and, from what Dave tells me, Ma Westlake has been going around town saying you told her that you hate Aunt Bessie, and that you fixed up your own room because I snore, and you said Bjornstam was too good for Bea, and then, just recent, that you were sore on the town because we don't all go down on our knees and beg for this Valborg fellow to come take supper with us. God only knows what else she says you said." "It's not true, any of it. I did like Mrs. Westlake, and I've called on her, and apparently she's gone and twisted everything I've said." "Sure, of course she would. Didn't I tell you she would? She's an old cat, like her pussyfooting, hand-holding husband. Lord, if I was sick, I'd rather have a faith healer than Westlake, and she's another slice off the same bacon. What I can't understand, though," she waited, taut, "is whatever possessed you to let her pump you, bright a girl as you are? I don't care what you told her. We all get peeved sometimes and want to blow off steam. That's natural. But if you wanted to keep it dark, why didn't you advertise it in the Dauntless, or get a megaphone and stand on top of the hotel and holler, or do anything besides spill it to her?" "I know, you told me, but she was so motherly, and I didn't have any woman. Vida's become so married and proprietary." "Well, next time you'll have better sense." He patted her head, flumped down behind his newspaper, said nothing more. Enemies leered through the windows, stole on her from the hall. She had no one save Eric. This kind, good man Kennicott, he was an elder brother. It was Eric, her fellow outcast, to whom she wanted to run for sanctuary. Through her storm she was, to the eye, sitting quietly with her fingers between the pages of a baby-blue book on home-dressing. But her dismay at Mrs. Westlake's treachery had risen to active dread. What had the woman said of her and Eric? What did she know? What had she seen? Who else would join in the baying hunt? Who else had seen her with Eric? What had she to fear from the Dyers, Cy Bogart, Juanita, Aunt Bessie? What precisely had she answered to Mrs. Bogart's questioning? All next day she was too restless to stay home, yet as she walked the streets on fictitious errands she was afraid of every person she met. She waited for them to speak, waited with foreboding. She repeated, "I mustn't ever see Eric again." But the words did not register. She had no ecstatic indulgence in the sense of guilt which is, to the women of Main Street, the surest escape from blank tediousness. At 5, crumpled in a chair in the living room, she started at the sound of the bell. Someone opened the door. She waited, uneasy. Vida Sherwin charged into the room. "Here's the one person I can trust," Carol rejoiced. Vida was serious but affectionate. She bustled at Carol with, "Oh, there you are, dearie. So glad to find you in. Sit down. Want to talk to you." Carol sat, obedient. Vida fussily tugged over a large chair and launched out. "I've been hearing vague rumors you were interested in this Eric Valborg. I knew you couldn't be guilty, and I'm surer than ever of it now. Here we are, as blooming as a daisy." "How does a respectable matron look when she feels guilty?" Carol sounded resentful. "Why, it would show. Besides, I know that you, of all people, are the one that can appreciate Dr. Will." "What have you been hearing?" "Nothing, really. I just heard Mrs. Bogart say she'd seen you and Valborg walking together a lot." Vida's chirping slackened. She looked at her nails. "But I suspect you do like Valborg. Oh, I don't mean in any wrong way. But you're young. You don't know what an innocent liking might drift into. You always pretend to be so sophisticated and all, but you're a baby. Just because you are so innocent, you don't know what evil thoughts may lurk in that fellow's brain." "You don't suppose Valborg could actually think about making love to me?" Her rather cheap sport ended abruptly as Vida cried, with contorted face, "What do you know about the thoughts in hearts? You just play at reforming the world. You don't know what it means to suffer." There are two insults which no human being will endure: the assertion that he hasn't a sense of humor, and the doubly impertinent assertion that he has never known trouble. Carol said furiously, "You think I don't suffer? You think I've always had an easy— No, you don't. I'm going to tell you something I've never told a living soul, not even Ray." The dam of repressed imagination which Vida had builded for years, which now, with Raymie off at the wars, she was building again, gave way. I liked Will terribly well. One time at a party— before he met you, of course— but we held hands, and we were so happy. But I didn't feel I was really suited to him. I let him go. Please don't think I still love him. I see now that Ray was predestined to be my mate. But because I liked him, I know how sincere and pure and noble Will is, and his thoughts never straying from the path of rectitude, and if I gave him up to you, at least you've got to appreciate him. We danced together and laughed so, and I gave him up. But this is my affair. I'm not intruding. I see the whole thing as he does, because of all I've told you. Maybe it's shameless to bare my heart this way, but I do it for him and you." Carol understood that Vida believed herself to have recited minutely and brazenly a story of intimate love, understood that, in alarm, she was trying to cover her shame as she struggled on. "Liked him in the most honorable way. Simply can't help it if I still see things through his eyes. If I gave him up, I certainly am not beyond my rights in demanding that you take care to avoid even the appearance of evil, and—" She was weeping, an insignificant, flushed, ungracefully weeping woman. Carol could not endure it. She ran to Vida, kissed her forehead, comforted her with a murmur of dove-like sounds, sought to reassure her with worn and hastily assembled gifts of words. "Oh, I appreciate it so much," and "You are so fine and splendid," and "Let me assure you, there isn't a thing to what you've heard," and "Oh, indeed, I do know how sincere Will is, and, as you say, so sincere." Vida believed that she had explained many deep and devious matters. She came out of her hysteria like a sparrow shaking off raindrops. She sat up and took advantage of her victory. "I don't want to rub it in, but you can see for yourself now this is all a result of your being so discontented and not appreciating the dear good people here. And another thing, people like you and me, who want to reform things, have to be particularly careful about appearances. Think how much better you can criticize conventional customs if you yourself live up to them scrupulously. Then people can't say you're attacking them to excuse your own infractions." To Carol was given a sudden, great philosophical understanding, an explanation of half the cautious reforms in history. "Yes, I've heard that plea. It's a good one. It sets revolts aside to cool. It keeps strays in the flock. To word it differently, you must live up to the popular code if you believe in it, but if you don't believe in it, then you must live up to it." "I don't think so at all," said Vida vaguely. She began to look hurt, and Carol let her be oracular. 3. Vida had done her a service, had made all agonizing seem so fatuous that she ceased writhing and saw that her whole problem was simple as mutton. She was interested in Eric's aspiration. Interest gave her a hesitating fondness for him, and the future would take care of the event. But at night, thinking in bed, she protested, "I'm not a falsely accused innocent, though. If it were someone more resolute than Eric, a fighter, an artist with bearded, surly lips, they're only in books. Is that the real tragedy, that I never shall know tragedy, never find anything but blustery complications that turn out to be a farce? No one big enough or pitiful enough to sacrifice for. Tragedy in neat blouses. The eternal flame all nice and safe in a kerosene stove. Neither heroic faith nor heroic guilt. Peeping at love from behind lace curtains on Main Street." Aunt Bessie crept in next day, tried to pump her, tried to prime the pump by again hinting that Kennicott might have his own affairs. Carol snapped, "Whatever I may do, I'll have you to understand that Will is only too safe." She wished afterward that she had not been so lofty. How much would Aunt Bessie make of "whatever I may do"? When Kennicott came home he poked at things and hemmed and brought out, "Saw Auntie this afternoon. She said you weren't very polite to her." Carol laughed. He looked at her in a puzzled way and fled to his newspaper. 4. She lay sleepless. She alternately considered ways of leaving Kennicott and remembered his virtues, pitied his bewilderment in the face of the subtle corroding sicknesses which he could not dose nor cut out. Didn't he perhaps need her more than did the book solaced Eric? Suppose Will were to die suddenly. Suppose she never again saw him at breakfast, silent but amiable, listening to her chatter. Suppose he never again played elephant for Hugh. Suppose— a country call, a slippery road, his motor skidding, the edge of the road crumbling, the car turning turtle, Will pinned beneath, suffering, brought home maimed, looking at her with spaniel eyes. Or waiting for her, calling for her, while she was in Chicago, knowing nothing of it. Suppose he were sued by some vicious, shrieking woman for malpractice. He tried to get witnesses. Westlake spread lies. His friends doubted him. His self-confidence was so broken that it was horrible to see the indecision of the decisive man. He was convicted, handcuffed, taken on a train. She ran to his room. At her nervous push the door swung sharply in, struck a chair. He awoke, gasped, then, in a steady voice, "What is it, dear? Anything wrong?" She darted to him, fumbled for the familiar harsh, bristly cheek. How well she knew it, every seam and hardness of bone and roll of fat. Yet when he sighed, "This is a nice visit," and dropped his hand on her thin-covered shoulder, she said, too cheerily, "I thought I heard you moaning. So silly of me. Good night, dear." 5. She did not see Eric for a fortnight, save once at church and once when she went to the tailor shop to talk over the plans, contingencies, and strategy of Kennicott's annual campaign for getting a new suit. Nat Hicks was there, and he was not so deferential as he had been. With unnecessary jauntiness he chuckled, "Some nice flannels, them samples, eh?" Needlessly, he touched her arm to call attention to the fashion plates, and humorously he glanced from her to Eric. At home, she wondered if the little beast might not be suggesting himself as a rival to Eric, but that abysmal bedragglement she would not consider. She saw Juanita Haydock slowly walking past the house, as Mrs. Westlake had once walked past. She met Mrs. Westlake in Uncle Whittier's store, and before that alert stare forgot her determination to be rude and was shakily cordial. She was sure that all the men on the street, even Guy Pollock and Sam Clark, leered at her in an interested, hopeful way, as though she were a notorious divorcee. She felt as insecure as a shadowed criminal. She wished to see Eric, and wished that she had never seen him. She fancied that Kennicott was the only person in town who did not know incomparably more than there was to know about herself and Eric. She crouched in her chair as she imagined men talking of her, thick-voiced, obscene, in barber-shops and the tobacco-stinking pool parlor. Through early autumn, Fern Mullins was the only person who broke the suspense. The frivolous teacher had come to accept Carol as of her own youth, and though school had begun, she rushed in daily to suggest dances, Welsh rabbit parties. Fern begged her to go as chaperone to a barn dance in the country on a Saturday evening. Carol could not go. The next day, the storm crashed. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. 1. Carol was on the back porch, tightening a bolt on the baby's go-kart this Sunday afternoon. Through an open window of the Bogart house she heard a screeching, heard Mrs. Bogart's haggish voice. "Did too, and there's no use in your denying it, no you don't. You march yourself right straight out of this house. Never in my life heard of such. Never had nobody talk to me like. Walk in the ways of sin and nastiness. Leave your clothes here, and heaven knows that's more than you deserve. Any of your lip, and I'll call the policeman." The voice of the other interlocutor Carol did not catch, nor, though Mrs. Bogart was proclaiming that he was her confidant and present assistant, did she catch the voice of Mrs. Bogart's God. Another row with Cy, Carol inferred. She trundled the go-kart down the back steps and tentatively wheeled it across the yard, proud of her repairs. She heard steps on the sidewalk. She saw not Cy Bogart, but Fern Mullins, carrying a suitcase, hurrying up the street with her head low. The widow, standing on the porch with buttery arms akimbo, yammered after the fleeing girl, "And don't you dare show your face on this block again. You can send the drayman for your trunk. My house has been contaminated long enough. Why the Lord should afflict me—" Fern was gone. The righteous widow glared, banged into the house, came out poking at her bonnet, marched away. By this time Carol was staring in a manner not visibly to be distinguished from the window-peeping of the rest of Gopher Prairie. She saw Mrs. Bogart enter the Howland house, then the Casses. Not till supper-time did she reach the Kennicotts. The doctor answered her ring and greeted her. "Well, well, how's the good neighbor?" The good neighbor charged into the living room, waving the most unctuous of black kid gloves, and delightedly sputtering, "You may well ask how I am. I really do wonder how I could go through the awful scenes of this day, and the impudence I took from that woman's tongue, that ought to be cut out." "Whoa, whoa, hold up!" roared Kennicott. "Who's the hussy, Sister Bogart? Sit down and take it cool, and tell us about it." "I can't sit down. I must hurry home. But I couldn't devote myself to my own selfish cares till I'd warned you, and heaven knows I don't expect any thanks for trying to warn the town against her. There's always so much evil in the world that folks simply won't see or appreciate your trying to safeguard them. And forcing herself in here to get in with you and Carrie, many's the time I've seen her doing it, and thank heaven she was found out in time before she could do any more harm. It simply breaks my heart and prostrates me to think what she may have done already, even if some of us that understand and know about things— Whoa up! Who are you talking about?" "She's talking about Fern Mullins," Carol put in, not pleasantly. "Huh?" Kennicott was incredulous. "I certainly am," flourished Mrs. Bogart. "And good and thankful you may be that I found her out in time, before she could get you into something, Carol, because even if you are my neighbor and Will's wife and a cultured lady, let me tell you right now, Carol Kennicott, that you ain't always as respectful to— you ain't as reverent. You don't stick by the good old ways like they was laid down for us by God in the Bible, and while, of course, there ain't a bit of harm in having a good laugh, and I know there ain't any real wickedness in you, yet, just the same, you don't fear God and hate the transgressors of His commandments like you ought to. And you may be thankful I found out this serpent I nourished in my bosom. And, oh yes indeed, my lady must have 2 eggs every morning for breakfast, and eggs 60 cents a dozen, and wa'n't satisfied with one like most folks. What did she care how much they cost, or if a person couldn't make hardly nothing on her board and room? In fact, I just took her in out of charity, and I might have known from the kind of stockings and clothes that she sneaked into my house in her trunk." Before they got her story, she had 5 more minutes of obscene wallowing. The gutter comedy turned into high tragedy, with Nemesis in black kid gloves. The actual story was simple, depressing, and unimportant. As to details, Mrs. Bogart was indefinite, and angry that she should be questioned. Fern Mullins and Cy had, the evening before, driven alone to a barn dance in the country. Carol brought out the admission that Fern had tried to get a chaperone. At the dance, Cy had kissed Fern. She confessed that. Cy had obtained a pint of whiskey. He said that he didn't remember where he had got it. Mrs. Bogart implied that Fern had given it to him. Fern herself insisted that he had stolen it from a farmer's overcoat, which, Mrs. Bogart raged, was obviously a lie. He had become soggily drunk. Fern had driven him home, deposited him, retching and wobbling, on the Bogart porch. Never before had her boy been drunk, shrieked Mrs. Bogart. When Kennicott grunted, she owned, "Well, maybe once or twice I've smelled liquor on his breath." She also, with an air of being only too scrupulously exact, granted that sometimes he did not come home till morning. But he couldn't ever have been drunk, for he always had the best excuses. The other boys had tempted him to go down the lake, spearing pickerel by torchlight, or he had been out in a machine that ran out of gas. Anyway, never before had her boy fallen into the hands of a designing woman. "What do you suppose Miss Mullins could design to do with him?" insisted Carol. Mrs. Bogart was puzzled, gave it up, went on. This morning, when she had faced both of them, Cy had manfully confessed that all of the blame was on Fern, because the teacher, his own teacher, had dared him to take a drink. Fern had tried to deny it. "Then," gabbled Mrs. Bogart, "then that woman had the impudence to say to me, 'What purpose could I have in wanting the filthy pup to get drunk?' That's just what she called him, pup. 'I'll have no such nasty language in my house,' I says, 'and you pretending and pulling the wool over people's eyes and making them think you're educated and fit to be a teacher and look out for young people's morals. You're worse'n any streetwalker,' I says. I'd let her have it good. I wasn't going to flinch from my bounden duty and let her think that decent folks had to stand for her vile talk. 'Purpose,' I says. 'Purpose? I'll tell you what purpose you had. Ain't I seen you making up to everything in pants that waste time and pay attention to your impertinence? Ain't I seen you showing off your legs with them short skirts of yours, trying to make out like you was so girlish and la-di-da running along the street?" Carol was very sick at this version of Fern's eager youth, but she was sicker as Mrs. Bogart hinted that no one could tell what had happened between Fern and Cy before the drive home. Without exactly describing the scene, by her power of lustful imagination, the woman suggested dark country places apart from the lanterns and rude fiddling and banging dance steps in the barn, then madness and harsh, hateful conquest. Carol was too sick to interrupt. It was Kennicott who cried, "Oh, for God's sake, quit it! You haven't any idea what happened. You haven't given us a single proof yet that Fern is anything but a rattle-brained youngster." "I haven't, eh? Well, what do you say to this? I came straight out and I says to her, 'Did you or did you not taste the whiskey Cy had?' And she says, 'I think I did take one sip. Cy made me,' she said. She owned up to that much, so you can imagine." "Does that prove her a prostitute?" asked Carol. "Carrie, don't you never use a word like that again," wailed the outraged Puritan. "Well, does it prove her to be a bad woman that she took a taste of whiskey? I've done it myself." "That's different. Not that I approve your doing it. What do the Scriptures tell us? Strong drink is a mocker, but that's entirely different from a teacher drinking with one of her own pupils." "Yes, it does sound bad. Vern was silly, undoubtedly. But as a matter of fact, she's only a year or two older than Cy, and probably a good many years younger in experience of vice." "That's not true. She is plenty old enough to corrupt him." "The job of corrupting Cy was done by your sinless town 5 years ago." Mrs. Bogart did not rage in return. Suddenly she was hopeless. Her head drooped. She patted her black kid gloves, picked at a thread of her faded brown skirt, and sighed. "He's a good boy, and awfully affectionate if you treat him right. Some thinks he's terrible wild, but that's because he's young. And he's so brave and truthful. Why, he was one of the first in town that wanted to enlist for the war, and I had to speak real sharp to him to keep him from running away. I didn't want him to get into no bad influences round these camps. And then—" Mrs. Bogart rose from her pitifulness, recovered her pace. "Then I go and bring into my own house a woman that's worse, when all's said and done, than any bad woman he could have met. You say this Mullins woman is too young and inexperienced to corrupt Cy. Well then, she's too young and inexperienced to teach him too, one or t'other. You can't have your cake and eat it. So it don't make no difference which reason they fire her for, and that's practically almost what I said to the school board." "Have you been telling this story to the members of the school board?" "I certainly have, every one of 'em. And their wives, I says to them, 'Tain't my affair to decide what you should or should not do with your teachers,' I says, 'and I ain't presuming to dictate in any way, shape, manner, or form. I just want to know,' I says, 'whether you're going to go on record as keeping here in our schools among a lot of innocent boys and girls a woman that drinks, smokes, curses, uses bad language, and does such dreadful things as I wouldn't lay tongue to, but you know what I mean,' I says. 'And, if so, I'll just see to it that the town learns about it.' And that's what I told Professor Mott, too, being superintendent. And he's a righteous man, not going autoing on the Sabbath like the school board members. And the professor as much as admitted he was suspicious of the Mullins woman himself." 2. Kennicott was less shocked and much less frightened than Carol, and more articulate in his description of Mrs. Bogart when she had gone. Maud Dyer telephoned to Carol, and after a rather improbable question about cooking lima beans with bacon, demanded, "Have you heard the scandal about Miss Mullins and Cy Bogart?" "I'm sure it's a lie." "Oh, probably is." Maud's manner indicated that the falsity of the story was an insignificant flaw in its general delightfulness. Carol crept to her room, sat with hands curled tight together as she listened to a plague of voices. She could hear the town yelping with it, every soul of them, gleeful at new details, panting to win importance by having details of their own to add. How well they would make up for what they had been afraid to do by imagining it in another. They who had not been entirely afraid, but merely careful and sneaky, all the barber-shop roués and millinery parlor mondaines, how archly they were giggling. This second she could hear them at it. With what self-commendation they were cackling their suavest wit. "You can't tell me she ain't a gay bird. I'm wise." And not one man in town to carry out their pioneer tradition of superb and contemptuous cursing, not one to verify the myth that their rough chivalry and rugged virtues were more generous than the petty scandal-picking of older lands, not one dramatic frontiersman to thunder with fantastic and fictional oaths, "What are you hinting at? What are you snickering at? What facts have you? What are these unheard-of sins you condemn so much, and like so well?" No one to say it. Not Kennicott, nor Guy Pollock, nor Champ Perry. Eric? Possibly. He would sputter uneasy protest. She suddenly wondered what subterranean connection her interest in Eric had with this affair. Wasn't it because they had been prevented by her caste from bounding on her own trail that they were howling at Fern? 3. Before supper she found, by half a dozen telephone calls, that Fern had fled to the Minniemashie house. She hastened there, trying not to be self-conscious about the people who looked at her on the street. The clerk said indifferently that he guessed Miss Mullins was up in room 37, and left Carol to find the way. She hunted along the stale-smelling corridors with their wallpaper of cerise daisies and poison-green rosettes, streaked in white spots from spilled water, their frayed red and yellow matting, and rows of pine doors painted a sickly blue. She could not find the number. In the darkness at the end of a corridor, she had to feel the aluminum figures on the door panels. She was startled once by a man's voice. "Yep, what do you want?" and fled. When she reached the right door, she stood listening. She made out a long sobbing. There was no answer till her third knock. Then an alarmed, "Who is it? Go away!" Her hatred of the town turned resolute as she pushed open the door. Yesterday she had seen Fern Mullins in boots and tweed skirt and canary-yellow sweater, fleet and self-possessed. Now she lay across the bed, in crumpled lavender cotton and shabby pumps, very feminine, utterly cowed. She lifted her head in stupid terror. Her hair was in tousled strings, and her face was sallow, creased. Her eyes were a blur from weeping. I didn't, was all she would say at first, and she repeated it while Carol kissed her cheek, stroked her hair, bathed her forehead. She rested then, while Carol looked about the room. The welcome to strangers, the sanctuary of hospitable Main Street, the lucrative property of Kennicott's friend Jackson Elder. It smelled of old linen and decaying carpet and ancient tobacco smoke. The bed was rickety, with a thin, knotty mattress. The sand-colored walls were scratched and gouged. In every corner, under everything, were fluffy dust and cigar ashes. On the tilted washstand was a nicked and squatty pitcher. The only chair was a grim straight object of spotty varnish. But there was an altogether splendid gilt and rose cuspidor. She did not try to draw out Fern's story. Fern insisted on telling it. She had gone to the party, not quite liking Cy, but willing to endure him for the sake of dancing, of escaping from Mrs. Bogart's flow of moral comments, of relaxing after the first strained weeks of teaching. Cy promised to be good. He was on the way out. There were a few workmen from Gopher Prairie at the dance, with many young farm people. Half a dozen squatters from a degenerate colony in a brush-hidden hollow, planters of potatoes, suspected thieves, came in noisily drunk. They all pounded the floor of the barn in old-fashioned square dances, swinging their partners, skipping, laughing, under the incantations of Del Snafflin the barber, who fiddled and called the figures. Cy had 2 drinks from pocket flasks. Fern saw him fumbling along the overcoats piled on the feed-box at the far end of the barn. Soon after, she heard a farmer declaring that someone had stolen his bottle. She taxed Cy with the theft. He chuckled, "Oh, it's just a joke. I'm going to give it back." He demanded that she take a drink. Unless she did, he wouldn't return the bottle. I just brushed my lips with it and gave it back to him," moaned Fern. She sat up, glared at Carol. "Did you ever take a drink?" "I have, a few. I'd love to have one right now. This contact with righteousness has about done me up." Fern could laugh then. "So would I. I don't suppose I've had 5 drinks in my life, but if I meet just one more Bogart and Son— Well, I didn't really touch that bottle. Horrible raw whiskey, though I'd have loved some wine. I felt so jolly. The barn was almost like a stage scene. The high rafters, and the dark stalls, and the tin lantern swinging, and a silage cutter up at the end like some mysterious kind of machine. And I'd been having lots of fun dancing with the nicest young farmer, so strong and nice and awfully intelligent. But I got uneasy when I saw how Cy was. So I doubt if I touched 2 drops of the beastly stuff. Do you suppose God is punishing me for even wanting wine?" "My dear, Mrs. Bogart's God may be, Main Street's God, but all the courageous, intelligent people are fighting him, though he slay us." Fern danced again with the young farmer. She forgot Cy while she was talking with a girl who had taken the university agricultural course. Cy could not have returned the bottle. He came staggering toward her, taking time to make himself offensive to every girl on the way and to dance a jig. She insisted on their returning. Cy went with her, chuckling and giggling. He kissed her outside the door. "And to think I used to think it was interesting to have men kiss you at a dance." She ignored the kiss in the need of getting him home before he started a fight. A farmer helped her harness the buggy, while Cy snored in the seat. He woke before they set out. All the way home he alternately slept and tried to make love to her. "I'm almost as strong as he is. I managed to keep him away while I drove. Such a rickety buggy. I didn't feel like a girl. I felt like a scrub woman. No, I guess I was too scared to have any feelings at all. It was terribly dark. I got home somehow, but it was hard, the time I had to get out, and it was quite muddy, to read a signpost. I lit matches that I took from Cy's coat pocket, and he followed me. He fell off the buggy step into the mud, and got up and tried to make love to me, and I was scared. But I hit him, quite hard, and got in, and so he ran after the buggy, crying like a baby, and I let him in again, and right away again he was trying. But no matter, I got him home. Up on the porch, Mrs. Bogart was waiting up. You know, it was funny. All the time she was, talking to me, and Cy was being terribly sick, I just kept thinking, I've still got to drive the buggy down to the livery stable. I wonder if the liveryman will be awake. But I got through somehow. I took the buggy down to the stable and got to my room. I locked my door, but Mrs. Bogart kept saying things outside the door, stood out there saying things about me, dreadful things, and rattling the knob. And all the while I could hear Cy in the backyard being sick. I don't think I'll ever marry any man. And then today, she drove me right out of the house. She wouldn't listen to me all morning, just to Cy. I suppose he's over his headache now. Even at breakfast he thought the whole thing was a grand joke. I suppose right this minute he's going around town boasting about his conquest. You understand. Oh, don't you understand? I did keep him away. But I don't see how I can face my school. They say country towns are fine for bringing up boys in, but I can't believe this is me, lying here and saying this. I don't believe what happened last night. Oh, this was curious. When I took off my dress last night, it was a darling dress, I loved it so, but of course the mud had spoiled it. I cried over it, and no matter. But my white silk stockings were all torn, and the strange thing is, I don't know whether I caught my legs in the briars when I got out to look at the signpost, or whether Cy scratched me when I was fighting him off. 4. Sam Clark was president of the school board. When Carol told him Fern's story, Sam looked sympathetic and neighborly, and Mrs. Clark sat by cooing, "Oh, isn't that too bad?" Carol was interrupted only when Mrs. Clark begged, "Dear, don't speak so bitter about pious people. There's lots of sincere practicing Christians that are real tolerant, like the Champ Perrys. Yes, I know. Unfortunately, there are enough kindly people in the churches to keep them going. When Carol had finished, Mrs. Clark breathed, "Poor girl. I don't doubt her story a bit." And Sam rumbled, "Yeah, sure. Miss Mullins is young and reckless, but everybody in town, except Ma Bogart, knows what Cy is. But Miss Mullins was a fool to go with him." "But not wicked enough to pay for it with disgrace." "No, but—" Sam avoided verdicts, clung to the entrancing horrors of the story. "Ma Bogart cussed her out all morning, did she? Jumped her neck, eh? Ma certainly is one hellcat." "Yes, you know how she is. So vicious." "Oh, no, her best style ain't her viciousness. What she pulls in our store is to come in smiling with Christian fortitude and keep a clerk busy for 1 hour while she picks out half a dozen four-penny nails. I remember one time—" "Sam!" Carol was uneasy. "You'll fight for Fern, won't you? When Mrs. Bogart came to see you, did she make definite charges?" "Well, yes, you might say she did." "But the school board won't act on them." "Guess we'll more or less have to." "But you'll exonerate Fern." "I'll do what I can for the girl personally, but you know what the board is. There's Reverend Zitterel. Sister Bogart about half runs his church, so of course he'll take her say-so. And Ezra Stowbody, as a banker, he has to be all hell for morality and purity. Might's well admit it, Carrie. I'm afraid there'll be a majority of the board against her. Not that any of us would believe a word Cy said, not if he swore it on a stack of Bibles. But still, after all this gossip, Miss Mullins wouldn't hardly be the party to chaperone our basketball team when it went out of town to play other high schools, would she?" "Perhaps not, but couldn't someone else?" "Why, that's one of the things she was hired for." Sam sounded stubborn. "Do you realize that this isn't just a matter of a job, and hiring and firing, that it's actually sending a splendid girl out with a beastly stain on her, giving all the other Bogarts in the world a chance at her? That's what will happen if you discharge her." Sam moved uncomfortably, looked at his wife, scratched his head, sighed, said nothing. "Won't you fight for her on the board? If you lose, won't you, and whoever agrees with you, make a minority report?" "No reports made in a case like this. Our rule is to just decide the thing and announce the final decision, whether it's unanimous or not." "Rules against a girl's future. Dear God, rules of a school board. Sam, won't you stand by Fern and threaten to resign from the board if they try to discharge her?" Rather testy, tired of so many subtleties, he complained, "Well, I'll do what I can, but I'll have to wait till the board meets." And "I'll do what I can," together with the secret admission, "Of course, you and I know what Ma Bogart is," was all Carol could get from Superintendent George Edward Mott, Ezra Stowbody, the Reverend Mr. Zitterel, or any other member of the school board. Afterward, she wondered whether Mr. Zitterel could have been referring to herself when he observed, "There's too much license in high places in this town, though, and the wages of sin is death, or anyway, being fired." The holy leer with which the priest said it remained in her mind. She was at the hotel before 8 next morning. Fern longed to go to school, to face the tittering, but she was too shaky. Carol read to her all day, and by reassuring her, convinced her own self that the school board would be just. She was less sure of it that evening, when, at the motion pictures, she heard Mrs. Goggerling exclaim to Mrs. Howland, "She may be so innocent and all, and I suppose she probably is, but still, if she drank a whole bottle of whiskey at that dance, the way everybody says she did, she may have forgotten she was so innocent. He he he." Maud Dyer, leaning back from her seat, put in, "That's what I've said all along. I don't want to roast anybody, but have you noticed the way she looks at men?" "When will they have me on the scaffold?" Carol speculated. Nat Hicks stopped the Kennicotts on their way home. Carol hated him for his manner of assuming that they two had a mysterious understanding. Without quite winking, he seemed to wink at her as he gurgled, What do you folks think about this Mullins woman? I'm not straight-laced, but I tell you, we got to have decent women in our schools. Do you know what I heard? They say whatever she may have done afterwards, this Mullins dame took 2 quarts of whiskey to the dance with her and got stewed before Cy did. Some tank, that Wren. Ha ha ha. Rats. I don't believe it, Kennicott muttered. He got Carol away before she was able to speak. She saw Eric passing the house, late, alone, and she stared after him, longing for the lively bitterness of the things he would say about the town. Kennicott had nothing for her but, "Oh, of course, everybody likes a juicy story, but they don't intend to be mean." She went up to bed, proving to herself that the members of the school board were superior men. It was Tuesday afternoon before she learned that the board had met at 10 in the morning and voted to accept Miss Fern Mullins' resignation. Sam Clark telephoned the news to her. "We're not making any charges. We're just letting her resign. Would you like to drop over to the hotel and ask her to write the resignation, now we've accepted it? Glad I could get the board to put it that way. It's thanks to you." "But can't you see that the town will take this as proof of the charges?" "We're not making no charges whatever." Sam was obviously finding it hard to be patient. Fern left town that evening. Carol went with her to the train. The 2 girls elbowed through a silent, lip-licking crowd. Carol tried to stare them down, but in face of the impishness of the boys and the bovine gaping of the men, she was embarrassed. Fern did not glance at them. Carol felt her arm tremble, though she was tearless, listless, plodding. She squeezed Carol's hand, said something unintelligible, stumbled up into the vestibule. Carol remembered that Miles Bjornstam had also taken a train. What would be the scene at the station when she herself took departure? She walked uptown behind 2 strangers. One of them was giggling. "See that good-looking wench that got on here? The swell kid with the small black hat? She's some charmer. I was here yesterday, before my jump to Ojibway Falls, and I heard all about her. Seems she was a teacher, but she certainly was a high roller. Oh, boy, high, wide, and fancy. Her and a couple of other skirts bought a whole case of whiskey and went on a tear, and one night, darned if this bunch of cradle robbers didn't get hold of some young kids, just small boys, and they all got lit up like a white way and went on to a roughneck dance, and they say—" The narrator turned, saw a woman near, and, not being a common person, nor a coarse workman, but a clever salesman and a householder, lowered his voice for the rest of the tale. During it, the other man laughed hoarsely. Carol turned off on a side street. She passed Cy Bogart. He was humorously narrating some achievement to a group which included Nat Hicks, Del Snafflin, Bert Tybee the bartender, and A. Tennyson O'Hearn, the shyster lawyer. They were men far older than Cy, but they accepted him as one of their own and encouraged him to go on. It was a week before she received from Fern a letter of which this was a part. "And, of course, my family did not really believe the story, but, as they were sure I must have done something wrong, they just lectured me generally, in fact, jawed me till I have gone to live at a boarding house. The teachers' agencies must know the story. Man at one almost slammed the door in my face when I went to ask about a job, and at another the woman in charge was beastly. Don't know what I will do. Don't seem to feel very well. May marry a fellow that's in love with me, but he's so stupid that he makes me scream. Dear Mrs. Kennicott, you were the only one that believed me. I guess it's a joke on me. I was such a simp. I felt quite heroic while I was driving the buggy back that night and keeping Cy away from me. I guess I expected the people in Gopher Prairie to admire me. I did used to be admired for my athletics at the U. Just 5 months ago." End of Chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. 1. For a month, which was one suspended moment of doubt, she saw Eric only casually, at an Eastern Star dance, at the shop, where, in the presence of Nat Hicks, they conferred with immense particularity on the significance of having 1 or 2 buttons on the cuff of Kennicott's new suit. For the benefit of beholders, they were respectably vacuous. Thus barred from him, depressed in the thought of Fern, Carol was suddenly and for the first time convinced that she loved Eric. She told herself 1,000 inspiriting things which he would say if he had the opportunity. For them she admired him, loved him. But she was afraid to summon him. He understood. He did not come. She forgot her every doubt of him, and her discomfort in his background. Each day it seemed impossible to get through the desolation of not seeing him. Each morning, each afternoon, each evening was a compartment divided from all other units of time, distinguished by a sudden, "Oh, I want to see Eric," which was as devastating as though she had never said it before. There were wretched periods when she could not picture him. Usually he stood out in her mind in some little moment, glancing up from his preposterous pressing iron, or running on the beach with Dave Dyer. But sometimes he had vanished. He was only an opinion. She worried then about his appearance. Weren't his wrists too large and red? Wasn't his nose a snub, like so many Scandinavians? Was he at all the graceful thing she had fancied? When she encountered him on the street, she was as much reassuring herself as rejoicing in his presence. More disturbing than being unable to visualize him was the darting remembrance of some intimate aspect. His face as they had walked to the boat together at the picnic, the ruddy light on his temples, neck cords, flat cheeks. On a November evening when Kennicott was in the country, she answered the bell and was confused to find Eric at the door, stooped, imploring, his hands in the pockets of his topcoat. As though he had been rehearsing his speech, he instantly besought, "Saw your husband driving away. I've got to see you. I can't stand it. Come for a walk. I know, people might see us, but they won't if we hike into the country. I'll wait for you by the elevator. Take as long as you want to. Oh, come quick." "In a few minutes," she promised. She murmured, "I'll just talk to him for a quarter of an hour and come home." She put on her tweed coat and rubber overshoes, considering how honest and hopeless are rubbers, how clearly their chaperonage proved that she wasn't going to a lover's tryst. She found him in the shadow of the grain elevator, sulkily kicking at a rail of the side track. As she came toward him, she fancied that his whole body expanded. But he said nothing, nor she. He patted her sleeve, she returned the pat, and they crossed the railroad tracks, found a road, clumped toward open country. "Chilly night, but I like this melancholy gray," he said. "Yes." They passed a moaning clump of trees and splashed along the wet road. He tucked her hand into the side pocket of his overcoat. She caught his thumb and, sighing, held it exactly as Hugh held hers when they went walking. She thought about Hugh. The current maid was in for the evening, but was it safe to leave the baby with her? The thought was distant and elusive. Eric began to talk, slowly, revealingly. He made for her a picture of his work in a large tailor shop in Minneapolis. The steam and heat, and the drudgery. The men in darned vests and crumpled trousers. Men who rushed growlers of beer and were cynical about women, who laughed at him and played jokes on him. But I don't mind, because I could keep away from them outside. I used to go to the Art Institute and the Walker Gallery, and tramp clear around Lake Harriet, or hike out to the Gates house and imagine it was a chateau in Italy and I lived in it. I was a marquise and collected tapestries. That was after I was wounded in Padua. The only really bad time was when a tailor named Finkelfar found a diary I was trying to keep, and he read it aloud in the shop. It was a bad fight. He laughed. I got fined $5, but that's all gone now. Seems as though you stand between me and the gas stoves, the long flames with mauve edges, licking up around the irons and making that sneering sound all day. Ah! Her fingers tightened about his thumb as she perceived the hot, low room, the pounding of the pressing irons, the reek of scorched cloth, and Eric among giggling gnomes. His fingertip crept through the opening of her glove and smoothed her palm. She snatched her hand away, stripped off her glove, tucked her hand back into his. He was saying something about a wonderful person. In her tranquility, she let the words blow by and heeded only the beating wings of his voice. She was conscious that he was fumbling for impressive speech. "Say, Carol, I've written a poem about you." "That's nice. Let's hear it." "Damn it, don't be so casual about it. Can't you take me seriously?" "My dear boy, if I took you seriously—" "I don't want us to be hurt more than we will be. Tell me the poem. I've never had a poem written about me." "It isn't really a poem. It's just some words that I love because it seems to me they catch what you are. Of course, probably, they won't seem so to anybody else, but, well, little and tender and merry and wise, with eyes that meet my eyes. Do you get the idea the way I do?" Yes, I'm terribly grateful. And she was grateful, while she impersonally noted how bad a verse it was. She was aware of the haggard beauty in the lowering night. Monstrous tattered clouds sprawled round a forlorn moon. Puddles and rocks glistened with inner light. They were passing a grove of scrub poplars, feeble by day, but looming now like a menacing wall. She stopped. They heard the branches dripping, the wet leaves sullenly plumping on the soggy earth. "Waiting, waiting, everything is waiting," she whispered. She drew her hand from his, pressed her clenched fingers against her lips. She was lost in the somberness. "I am happy, so we must go home, before we have time to become unhappy. But can't we sit on a log for a minute and just listen?" "No, too wet. But I wish we could build a fire, and you could sit on my overcoat beside it. I'm a grand fire builder. My cousin Lars and me spent a week one time in a cabin way up in the big woods, snowed in. The fireplace was filled with a dome of ice when we got there, but we chopped it out and jammed the thing full of pine boughs. Couldn't we build a fire back here in the woods and sit by it for a while?" She pondered, halfway between yielding and refusal. Her head ached faintly. She was in abeyance. Everything, the night, his silhouette, the cautious treading future, was as undistinguishable as though she were drifting bodiless in a fourth dimension. While her mind groped, the lights of a motor-car swooped round a bend in the road, and they stood farther apart. "What ought I to do?" she mused. "I think— Oh, I won't be robbed. I am good. If I'm so enslaved that I can't sit by the fire with a man and talk, then I'd better be dead." The lights of the thrumming car grew magically, were upon them, abruptly stopped. From behind the dimness of the windshield a voice, annoyed, sharp, "Hello there!" She realized that it was Kennicott. The irritation in his voice smoothed out. "Having a walk?" They made schoolboyish sounds of assent. "Pretty wet, isn't it? Better ride back. Jump in front here, Valborg." His manner of swinging open the door was a command. Carol was conscious that Eric was climbing in, that she was apparently to sit in the back, and that she had been left to open the rear door for herself. Instantly, the wonder which had flamed to the gutsy skies was quenched, and she was Mrs. W.P. Kennicott of Gopher Prairie, riding in a squeaking old car and likely to be lectured by her husband. She feared what Kennicott would say to Eric. She bent toward them. Kennicott was observing, "Going to have some rain before the night's over, all right?" "Yes," said Eric. "Been funny season this year anyway. Never saw it with such a cold October and such a nice November. 'Member we had a snow way back on October 9th? But it certainly was nice up to the 21st this month. As I remember it, not a flake of snow in November so far, has there been? But I shouldn't wonder if we be having some snow most any time now." "Yes, good chance of it," said Eric. "Wish I'd had more time to go after the ducks this fall. By golly, what do you think?" Kennicott sounded appealing. "Fellow wrote me from Mantrap Lake that he shot 7 mallards and a couple of canvasback in 1 hour." "That must have been fine," said Eric. Carol was ignored, but Kennicott was blusterously cheerful. He shouted to a farmer as he slowed up to pass the frightened team. "There we are! Schon gut!" She sat back, neglected, frozen, unheroic heroine in a drama insanely undramatic. She made a decision resolute and enduring. She would tell Kennicott. What would she tell him? She could not say that she loved Eric. Did she love him? But she would have it out. She was not sure whether it was pity for Kennicott's blindness or irritation at his assumption that he was enough to fill any woman's life which prompted her, but she knew that she was out of the trap, that she could be frank, and she was exhilarated with the adventure of it, while in front he was entertaining Eric. "Nothing like an hour on a duck pass to make you relish your victuals, and gosh, this machine hasn't got the power of a fountain pen. Guess the cylinders are jam-cram full of carbon again. Don't know but what maybe I'll have to put in another set of piston rings." He stopped on Main Street and clucked hospitably. "There, that'll give you just a block to walk. Good night." Carol was in suspense. Would Eric sneak away? He stolidly moved to the back of the car, thrust in his hand, muttered, "Good night, Carol. I'm glad we had our walk." She pressed his hand. The car was flapping on. He was hidden from her by a corner drugstore on Main Street. Kennicott did not recognize her till he drew up before the house. Then he condescended, "Better jump out here, and I'll take the boat around back. Say, see if the back door is unlocked, will you?" She unlatched the door for him. She realized that she still carried the damp glove she had stripped off for Eric. She drew it on. She stood in the center of the living room, unmoving, in damp coat and muddy rubbers. Kennicott was as opaque as ever. Her task wouldn't be anything so lively as having to endure a scolding, but only an exasperating effort to command his attention so that he would understand the nebulous thing she had to tell him, instead of interrupting her by yawning, winding the clock, and going up to bed. She heard him shoveling coal into the furnace. He came through the kitchen energetically, but before he spoke to her, he did stop in the hall, did wind the clock. He sauntered into the living room, and his glance passed from her drenched hat to her smeared rubbers. She could hear, see, taste, smell, touch, his, "Better take off your coat, Carrie. Looks kind of wet." Yes, there it was. "Well, Carrie, you better—" He chucked his own coat on a chair, stalked to her, went on with a rising, tingling voice. "You better cut it out now. I'm not going to do the outraged husband stunt. I like you, and I respect you, and I'd probably look like a boob if I tried to be dramatic. But I think it's about time for you and Valborg to call a halt before you get in Dutch, like Fern Mullins did." "Do you?" "Course. I know all about it. What do you expect in a town that's as filled with busybodies that have plenty of time to stick their noses into other folks' business as this is? Not that they have the nerve to do much tattling to me, but they've hinted around a lot, and anyway, I could see for myself that you liked him. But, of course, I knew how cold you were. I knew you wouldn't stand it even if Valborg did try to hold your hand or kiss you, so I didn't worry. But same time, I hope you don't suppose this husky young Swede farmer is as innocent and platonic and all that stuff as you are. Wait now, don't get sore. I'm not knocking him. He isn't a bad sort, and he's young and likes to gas about books. Course you like him. That isn't the real rub. But haven't you just seen what this town can do once it goes and gets a moral on you like it did with Fern? You probably think that two young folks making love are alone if anybody ever is, but there's nothing in this town that you don't do in company with a whole lot of uninvited but awful interested guests. Don't you realize that if Ma Westlake and a few others get started, they'd drive you up a tree, and you'd find yourself so well advertised as being in love with this Valborg fellow that you'd have to be just to spite 'em?" "Let me sit down," was all Carol could say. She drooped on the couch, wearily, without elasticity. He yawned. Give me your coat and rubbers." And while she stripped them off, he twiddled his watch chain, felt the radiator, peered at the thermometer. He shook out her wraps in the hall, hung them up with exactly his usual care. He pushed a chair near to her and sat bolt up. He looked like a physician about to give sound and undesired advice. Before he could launch into his heavy discourse, she desperately got in, "Please, I want you to know that I was going to tell you everything tonight." "Well, I don't suppose there's really much to tell." "But there is. I'm fond of Eric. He appeals to something in here." She touched her breast. "And I admire him. He isn't just a young Swede farmer. He's an artist." "Wait now. He's had a chance all evening to tell you what a whale of a fine fellow he is. Now it's my turn. I can't talk artistic, but— Carrie, do you understand my work?" He leaned forward, thick, capable hands on thick, sturdy thighs, mature and slow, yet beseeching. "No matter even if you are cold, I like you better than anybody in the world. One time I said that you were my soul, and that still goes. You're all the things that I see in a sunset when I'm driving in from the country, the things that I like but can't make poetry of. Do you realize what my job is? I go round 24 hours a day, in mud and blizzard, trying my damnedest to heal everybody, rich or poor. You, that are always spieling about how scientists ought to rule the world instead of a bunch of spread-eagle politicians, can't you see that I'm all the science there is here? And I can stand the cold and the bumpy roads and the lonely rides at night. All I need is to have you here at home to welcome me. I don't expect you to be passionate. Not any more, I don't. But I do expect you to appreciate my work. I bring babies into the world and save lives and make cranky husbands quit being mean to their wives. And then you go and moon over a Swede tailor because he can talk about how to put ruchings on a skirt. Hell of a thing for a man to fuss over." She flew out at him. "You make your side clear. Let me give mine. I admit all you say, except about Eric. But is it only you and the baby that want me to back you up, that demand things from me? They're all on me, the whole town. I can feel their hot breaths on my neck. Aunt Bessie and that horrible slavering old Uncle Whittier and Juanita and Mrs. Westlake and Mrs. Bogart and all of them. And you welcome them. You encourage them to drag me down into their cave. I won't stand it. Do you hear? Now, right now, I'm done. And it's Eric who gives me the courage. You say he just thinks about ruches, which do not usually go on skirts, by the way. I tell you, he thinks about God, the God that Mrs. Bogart covers up with greasy gingham wrappers. Eric will be a great man some day, and if I could contribute one tiny bit to his success— Wait now. Hold up. You're assuming that your Eric will make good. As a matter of fact, at my age, he'll be running a one-man tailor shop in some burg about the size of Schoenstrom. He will not. That's what he's headed for now, all right, and he's 25 or 6, and what's he done to make you think he'll ever be anything but a pants-presser? He has sensitiveness and talent. Wait now. What has he actually done in the art line? Has he done one first-class picture, or sketch, do you call it? Or one poem, or played the piano, or anything except gas about what he's going to do?" She looked thoughtful. "Then it's 100-to-1 shot that he never will. Way I understand it, even these fellows that do something pretty good at home and get to go to art school, there ain't more than 1 out of 10 of 'em, maybe 1 out of 100, that ever get above grinding out a bum living, about as artistic as plumbing. And when it comes down to this tailor, why, can't you see, you that take on so about psychology, can't you see that it's just by contrast with folks like Doc McGanum or Lime Cass that this fellow seems artistic? Suppose you met up with him first in one of these regular New York studios. You wouldn't notice him any more'n a rabbit." She huddled over folded hands like a temple virgin shivering on her knees before the thin warmth of a brazier. She could not answer. Kennicott rose quickly, sat on the couch, took both her hands. "Suppose he fails, as he will. Suppose he goes back to tailoring, and you're his wife. Is that going to be this artistic life you've been thinking about?" He's in some bum shack, pressing pants all day, or stooped over sewing, and having to be polite to any grouch that blows in and jams a dirty stinking old suit in his face and says, "Here, you, fix this, and be blamed quick about it." He won't even have enough savvy to get him a big shop. He'll pike along doing his own work, unless you, his wife, go help him in the shop, and stand over a table all day, pushing a big heavy iron. Your complexion will look fine after about 15 years of baking that way, won't it? And you'll be humped over like an old hag. And probably you'll live in one room back of the shop. And then at night, oh, you'll have your artist, sure. He'll come in stinking of gasoline and cranky from hard work, and hinting around that if it hadn't been for you, he'd have gone east and been a great artist. Sure, and you'll be entertaining his relatives. Talk about Uncle Whit. You'll be having some old Axel Axelberg coming in with manure on his boots and sitting down to supper in his socks and yelling at you, "Hurry up now, you women make me sick." Yes, and you'll have a squalling brat every year, tugging at you while you press clothes, and you won't love him like you do Hugh upstairs, all downy and asleep. Please, not any more. Her face was on his knee. He bent to kiss her neck. I don't want to be unfair. I guess love is a great thing, all right. But think it would stand much of that kind of stuff? Oh, honey, am I so bad? Can't you like me at all? I've been so fond of you. She snatched up his hand. She kissed it. Presently she sobbed, I won't ever see him again. I can't now. The hot living room behind the tailor shop, I don't love him enough for that. And you are... Even if I were sure of him, sure he was the real thing, I don't think I could actually leave you. This marriage, it weaves people together. It's not easy to break, even when it ought to be broken. And do you want to break it? No. He lifted her, carried her upstairs, laid her on her bed, turned to the door. Come kiss me, she whimpered. He kissed her lightly and slipped away. For an hour she'd heard him moving about his room, lighting a cigar, drumming with his knuckles on a chair. She felt that he was a bulwark between her and the darkness that grew thicker as the delayed storm came down in sleet. 2. He was cheery and more casual than ever at breakfast. All day she tried to devise a way of giving Eric up. Telephone? The village central would unquestioningly listen in. A letter? It might be found. Go to see him? Impossible. That evening Kennicott gave her, without comment, an envelope. The letter was signed E.V. I know I can't do anything but make trouble for you, I think. I'm going to Minneapolis tonight, and from there, as soon as I can, either to New York or Chicago. I will do as big things as I can. I can't write I love you too much. God keep you. Until she heard the whistle which told her that the Minneapolis train was leaving town, she kept herself from thinking, from moving. Then it was all over. She had no plan nor desire for anything. When she caught Kennicott looking at her over his newspaper, she fled to his arms, thrusting the paper aside. And for the first time in years they were lovers. But she knew that she still had no plan in life, save always to go along the same streets, past the same people, to the same shops. 3. A week after Eric's going, the maid startled her by announcing, "There's a Mr. Valborg downstairs, say he want to see you." She was conscious of the maid's interested stare, angry at this shattering of the calm in which she had hidden. She crept down, peeped into the living room. It was not Eric Valborg who stood there. It was a small, gray-bearded, yellow-faced man in mucky boots, canvas jacket, and red mittens. He glowered at her with shrewd red eyes. "You the doc's wife?" "Yes." "I'm Adolf Valborg, from up by Jefferson. I'm Eric's father." "Oh." He was a monkey-faced little man, and not gentle. "What you done with my son?" "I don't think I understand you." "I think you're going to understand before I get through. Where is he?" "Why, really, I presume he's in Minneapolis." You presume." He looked through her with a contemptuous such as she could not have imagined. Only an insane contortion of spelling could betray his lyric whine, his mangled consonants. He clamored, "Presume! That's a fine word. I don't want no fine words, and I don't want no more lies. I want to know what you know." "See here, Mr. Valborg, you may stop this bullying right now. I'm not one of your farm women. I don't know where your son is, and there's no reason why I should know." Her defiance ran out in face of his immense flaxen stolidity. He raised his fist, worked up his anger with the gesture, and sneered, "You dirty city women with your fine ways and fine dresses. A father come here trying to save his boy from wickedness, and you call him a bully. By God, I don't have to take nothing off you, nor your husband. I ain't one of your hired men. For one time, a woman like you is going to hear the truth about what you are, and no fine city words to it, neither." "Really, Mr. Valborg,
what you done with him, hey? I used tell you what you done. He was a good boy, even if he was a damn fool. I want him back on the farm. He don't make enough money tailoring, and I can't get me no hired man. I want to take him back on the farm, and you butt in and fool with him and make love with him and get him to run away."
"You are lying. It's not true that—" "It's not true, and if it were, you have no right to speak like this."
"Don't talk foolish. I know. Ain't I heard from a fellow that live right here in town how you been acting with the boy? I know what you done. Walking with him in the country, hiding in the woods with him. Yes, and I guess you talk about religion in the woods. Sure, women like you're worse than the street walkers. Rich women like you, with fine husbands and no decent work to do. And me, look at my hands. Look how I work. Look at those hands. But you, oh God, no, you mustn't work. You're too fine to do decent work. You got to play with young fellows, younger as you are, laughing and rolling around and acting like the animals. You let my son alone, do you hear?"
He was shaking his fist in her face. She could smell the manure and sweat.
"It ain't no use talking to women like you. Get no truth out of you. But next time I go by your husband."
He was marching into the hall. Carol flung herself on him, her clenching hand on his hayseed dusty shoulder. "You horrible old man! You've always tried to turn Eric into a slave, to fatten your pocketbook. You've sneered at him and overworked him, and probably you've succeeded in preventing his ever rising above your muck heap. And now, because you can't drag him back, you come here to vent. Go tell my husband. Go tell him. And don't blame me when he kills you. When my husband kills you. He will kill you." The man grunted, looked at her impassively, said one word, and walked out. She heard the word very plainly. She did not quite reach the couch. Her knees gave way. She pitched forward. She heard her mind saying, "You haven't fainted. This is ridiculous. You're simply dramatizing yourself. Get up." But she could not move. When Kennicott arrived, she was lying on the couch. His step quickened. "What's happened, Carrie? You haven't got a bit of blood in your face." She clutched his arm. "You've got to be sweet to me and kind. I'm going to California. Mountains. Sea. Please don't argue about it, because I'm going." Quietly. "All right, we'll go. You and I. Leave the kid here with Aunt Bessie." "Now." "Well, yes, just as soon as we can get away. Now, don't talk any more. Just imagine you've already started." He smoothed her hair, and not till after supper did he continue. "I meant it about California, but I think we better wait 3 weeks or so, till I get hold of some young fellow released from the medical corps to take my practice, and if people are gossiping, you don't want to give 'em a chance by running away. Can you stand it and face 'em for 3 weeks or so?" "Yes," she said emptily. 4. People covertly stared at her on the street. Aunt Bessie tried to catechize her about Eric's disappearance, and it was Kennicott who silenced the woman with a savage, "Say, are you hinting that Carrie had anything to do with that fellow's beating it?
Then let me tell you, and you can go right out and tell the whole bloomin' town, that Carrie and I took Eric riding, and he asked me about getting a better job in Minneapolis, and I advised him to go to it. Getting much sugar in at the store now?"
Guy Pollock crossed the street to be pleasant apropos of California and new novels. Vida Sherwin dragged her to the Jolly 17. There, with everyone rigidly listening, Maud Dyer shot at Carol. "I hear Eric has left town." Carol was amiable. "Yes, so I hear. In fact, he called me up, told me he had been offered a lovely job in the city. So sorry he's gone. He would have been valuable if we tried to start the Dramatic Association again. Still, I wouldn't be here for the association myself, because Will is all in from work, and I'm thinking of taking him to California. Juanita, you know the coast so well. Tell me, would you start in at Los Angeles or San Francisco, and what are the best hotels?" The Jolly 17 looked disappointed, but the Jolly 17 liked to give advice. The Jolly 17 liked to mention the expensive hotels at which they had stayed. A meal counted as a stay. Before they could question her again, Carol escorted in with drum and fife the topic of Raimy Weatherspoon. Vida had news from her husband. He had been gassed in the trenches, had been in a hospital for 2 weeks, had been promoted to major, was learning French. She left Hugh with Aunt Bessie. But for Kennicott, she would have taken him. She hoped that in some miraculous way yet unrevealed she might find it possible to remain in California. She did not want to see Gopher Prairie again. The Smales were to occupy the Kennicott house, and quite the hardest thing to endure in the month of waiting was the series of conferences between Kennicott and Uncle Whittier in regard to heating the garage and having the furnace flues cleaned. Did Carol, Kennicott inquired, wish to stop in Minneapolis to buy new clothes? "No, I want to get as far away as I can as soon as I can. Let's wait till Los Angeles." Sure, just as you like. Cheer up. We're going to have a large, wide time, and everything'll be different when we come back." 4. Dusk on a snowy December afternoon. The sleeper, which would connect at Kansas City with the California train, rolled out of St. Paul with a chick-a-chick, chick-a-chick, chick-a-chick as it crossed the other tracks. It bumped through the factory belt, gained speed. Carol could see nothing but gray fields, which had closed in on her all the way from Gopher Prairie. Ahead was darkness. For an hour in Minneapolis, I must have been near Eric. He's still there somewhere. He'll be gone when I come back. I'll never know where he has gone. As Kennicott switched on the seat light, she turned drearily to the illustrations in a motion picture magazine. End of Chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. They journeyed for 3.5 months. They saw the Grand Canyon, the adobe walls of Santa Fe, and, in a drive from El Paso into Mexico, their first foreign land. They jogged from San Diego and La Jolla to Los Angeles, Pasadena, Riverside, through towns with bell-towered missions and orange groves. They viewed Monterey and San Francisco and a forest of sequoias. They bathed in the surf and climbed foothills and danced. They saw a polo game and the making of motion pictures. They sent 117 souvenir postcards to Gopher Prairie. And once, on a dune by a foggy sea when she was walking alone, Carol found an artist, and he looked up at her and said, "Too damn wet to paint. Sit down and talk." And so, for 10 minutes, she lived in a romantic novel. Her only struggle was in coaxing Kennicott not to spend all his time with the tourist from the 10,000 other Gopher Prairies. In winter, California is full of people from Iowa and Nebraska, Ohio and Oklahoma, who, having traveled thousands of miles from their familiar villages, hasten to secure an illusion of not having left them. They hunt for people from their own states to stand between them and the shame of naked mountains. They talk steadily, in Pullmans, on hotel porches, at cafeterias and motion picture shows, about the motors and crops and county politics back home. Kennicott discussed land prices with them. He went into the merits of the several sorts of motor cars with them. He was intimate with train porters, and he insisted on seeing the Luke Dawsons at their flimsy bungalow in Pasadena, where Luke sat and yearned to go back and make some more money. But Kennicott gave promise of learning to play. He shouted in the pool at the Coronado, and he spoke of, though he did nothing more radical than speak of, buying evening clothes. Carol was touched by his efforts to enjoy picture galleries, and the dogged way in which he accumulated dates and dimensions when they followed monkish guides through missions. She felt strong. Whenever she was restless, she dodged her thoughts by the familiar vagabond fallacy of running away from them, of moving on to a new place, and thus she persuaded herself that she was tranquil. In March, she willingly agreed with Kennicott that it was time to go home. She was longing for Hugh. They left Monterey on April 1st, on a day of high blue skies and poppies and a summer sea. As the train struck in among the hills, she resolved, "I'm going to love the fine Will Kennicott quality that there is in Gopher Prairie, the nobility of good sense. It will be sweet to see Vida and Guy and the Clarks, and I'm going to see my baby. All the words he'll be able to say now. It's a new start. Everything will be different." Thus, on April 1st, among dappled hills and the bronze of scrub oaks, while Kennicott seesawed on his toes and chuckled, "Wonder what Hugh'll say when he sees us." 3 days later, they reached Gopher Prairie in a sleet storm. 2. No one knew that they were coming. No one met them. And because of the icy roads, the only conveyance at the station was the hotel bus, which they missed while Kennicott was giving his trunk check to the station agent, the only person to welcome them. Carol waited for him in the station, among huddled German women with shawls and umbrellas, and ragged bearded farmers in corduroy coats. Peasants, mute as oxen, in a room thick with the steam of wet coats, the reek of the red-hot stove, the stench of sawdust boxes which served as cuspidors. The afternoon light was as reluctant as a winter dawn. "This is a useful market center, an interesting pioneer post, but it is not a home for me," meditated the stranger, Carol. Kennicott suggested, "I'd phone for a flivver, but it'd take quite a while for it to get here. Let's walk." They stepped uncomfortably from the safety of the plank platform and, balancing on their toes, taking cautious strides, ventured along the road. The sleety rain was turning to snow. The air was stealthily cold. Beneath an inch of water was a layer of ice, so that as they wavered with their suitcases, they slid and almost fell. The wet snow drenched their gloves. The water underfoot splashed their itching ankles. They scuffled inch by inch for 3 blocks. In front of Harry Haydock's, Kennicott sighed, "We better stop in here and phone for a machine." She followed him like a wet kitten. The Haydocks saw them laboring up the slippery concrete walk, up the perilous front steps, and came to the door chanting, "Well, well, well, back again, eh? Say, this is fine. Have a fine trip? My, you look like a rose, Carol. How did you like the coast, Doc? Well, 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 where all did you go?" But as Kennicott began to proclaim the list of places achieved, Harry interrupted with an account of how much he himself had seen 2 years ago, when Kennicott boasted, "We went through the mission at Santa Barbara." Harry broke in, "Yeah, that's an interesting old mission. Say, I'll never forget that hotel there, Doc. It was swell. Why, the rooms were made just like these old monasteries. Juanita and I went from Santa Barbara to San Luis Obispo. You folks go to San Luis Obispo?" "No, but, well, you ought to have gone to San Luis Obispo. And then we went from there to a ranch. Least they called it a ranch." Kennicott got in only one considerable narrative, which began, "Say, I never knew, did you, Harry, that in the Chicago district the Cuts car sells as well as the Overland? I never thought much of the Cuts, but I met a gentleman on the train. It was when we were pulling out of Albuquerque, and I was sitting on the back platform of the observation car, and this man was next to me, and he asked me for a light, and we got to talking. And come to find out, He came from Aurora, and when he found out I came from Minnesota, he asked me if I knew Dr. Clemworth of Red Wing, and of course, while I've never met him, I've heard of Clemworth lots of times, and seems he's this man's brother. Quite a coincidence. Well, we got to talking, and we called the porter. That was a pretty good porter on that car, and we had a couple bottles of ginger ale, and I happened to mention the Klutz car. And this man, seems he's driven a lot of different kinds of cars, he's got a Franklin now, and he said that he'd tried the Klutz and liked it first rate. Well, when we got into a station, I don't remember the name of it. Carrie, what the deuce was the name of that first stop we made the other side of Albuquerque? Well, anyway, I guess we must have stopped there to take on water, and this man and I got out to stretch our legs, and darned if there wasn't a Klutz drawn right up at the depot platform. And he pointed out something I'd never noticed, and I was glad to learn about it. Seems that the gear lever in the Klutz is an inch longer. Even this chronicle of voyages Harry interrupted, with remarks on the advantages of the ball gear shift. Kennicott gave up hope of adequate credit for being a traveled man, and telephoned to a garage for a Ford taxicab, while Juanita kissed Carol and made sure of being the first to tell her the latest, which included 7 distinct and proven scandals about Mrs. Swiftwaite, and one considerable doubt as to the chastity of Cy Bogart. They saw the Ford sedan making its way over the water-lined ice through the snowstorm like a tugboat in a fog. The driver stopped at a corner. The car skidded. It turned about with comic reluctance, crashed into a tree, and stood tilted on a broken wheel. The Kennicotts refused Harry Haydock's not too urgent offer to take them home in his car. "If I can manage to get it out of the garage. Terrible day. Stayed home from the store. But if you say so, I'll take a shot at it." Carol gurgled. "No, I think we'd better walk. Probably make better time, and I'm just crazy to see my baby." With their suitcases, they waddled on. Their coats were soaked through. Carol had forgotten her facile hopes. She looked about with impersonal eyes. But Kennicott, through rain-blurred lashes, caught the glory that was back home. She noted bare tree trunks, black branches, the spongy brown earth between patches of decayed snow on the lawns. The vacant lots were full of tall dead weeds. Stripped of summer leaves, the houses were hopeless, temporary shelters. Kennicott chuckled. "By golly, look down there. Jack Elder must have painted his garage. And look, Martin Mahoney has put up a new fence around his chicken yard. Say, that's a good fence, eh? Chicken tight and dog tight. That's certainly a dandy fence. Wonder how much it cost a yard. Yes, sir, they've been building right along, even in winter. Got more enterprise than these Californians. Pretty good to be home, eh?" She noted that all winter long the citizens had been throwing garbage into their backyards to be cleaned up in spring. The recent thaw had disclosed heaps of ashes, dog bones, torn bedding, clotted paint cans, all half covered by the icy pools which filled the hollows of the yards. The refuse had stained the water to vile colors of waste, thin red, sour yellow, streaky brown. Kennicott chuckled. "Look over there on Main Street. They got the feed store all fixed up, and a new sign on it, black and gold. That'll improve the appearance of the block a lot." She noted that the few people whom they passed wore their raggedest coats for the evil day. They were scarecrows in shantytown. "To think," she marveled, "of coming 2,000 miles, past mountains and cities, to get off here, and to plan to stay here. What conceivable reason for choosing this particular place?" She noted a figure in a rusty coat and a cloth cap. Kennicott chuckled. "Look who's coming! It's Sam Clark. Gosh, all rigged out for the weather." The two men shook hands a dozen times, and, in the Western fashion, bumbled, "Well, well, 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 you old hellhound, you old devil, how are you anyway? You old horse thief, maybe it ain't good to see you again." While Sam nodded at her over Kennicott's shoulder, she was embarrassed. "Perhaps I should never have gone away. I'm out of practice in lying. I wish they would get it over. Just a block more and my baby." They were home. She brushed past the welcoming Aunt Bessie and knelt by Hugh. As he stammered,
"Oh, Mummy, Mummy, don't go away. Stay with me, Mummy," she cried. "No, I'll never leave you again." He volunteered. "That's Daddy." "By golly, he knows us just as if we'd never been away," said Kennicott. "You don't find any of these California kids as bright as he is at his age." When the trunk came, they piled about Hugh the bewhiskered little wooden men fitting one inside another, the miniature junk and the oriental drum from San Francisco Chinatown, the blocks carved by the old Frenchman in San Diego, the lariat from San Antonio. "Will you forgive Mummy for going away, will you?" she whispered. Absorbed in Hugh, asking 100 questions about him. Had he had any colds? Did he still dawdle over his oatmeal? What about unfortunate morning incidents? She viewed Aunt Bessie only as a source of information, and was able to ignore her hint, pointed by a coyly shaken finger. "Now that you've had such a fine long trip, and spent so much money and all, I hope you're going to settle down and be satisfied, and not—" "Does he like carrots yet?" replied Carol. She was cheerful as the snow began to conceal the slatternly yards. She assured herself that the streets of New York and Chicago were as ugly as Gopher Prairie in such weather. She dismissed the thought. "But they do have charming interiors for refuge," she sang as she energetically looked over Hugh's clothes. The afternoon grew old and dark. Aunt Bessie went home. Carol took the baby into her own room. The maid came in complaining, "I can't get no extra milk to make chip beef for supper." Hugh was sleepy, and he had been spoiled by Aunt Bessie. Even to a returned mother, his whining and his trick of 7 times snatching her silver brush were fatiguing. As a background, behind the noises of Hugh and the kitchen, the house reeked with a colorless stillness. From the window she heard Kennicott greeting the Widow Bogart as he had always done, always, every snowy evening. "Guess this'll keep up all night." She waited. There they were, the furnace sounds, unalterable, eternal, removing ashes, shoveling coal. Yes, she was back home. Nothing had changed. She had never been away. California? Had she seen it? Had she for 1 minute left this scraping sound of the small shovel in the ash pit of the furnace? But Kennicott preposterously supposed that she had. Never had she been quite so far from going away as now, when he believed she had just come back. She felt oozing through the walls the spirit of small houses and righteous people. At that instant she knew that in running away she had merely hidden her doubts behind the officious stir of travel. "Dear God, don't let me begin agonizing again," she sobbed. Hugh wept with her. "Wait for Mummy a second." She hastened down to the cellar, to Kennicott. He was standing before the furnace. However inadequate the rest of the house, he had seen to it that the fundamental cellar should be large and clean, the square pillars whitewashed, and the bins for coal and potatoes and trunks convenient. A glow from the drafts fell on the smooth gray cement floor at his feet. He was whistling tenderly, staring at the furnace with eyes which saw the black-domed monster as a symbol of home, and of the beloved routine to which he had returned, his gypsying decently accomplished, his duty of viewing sights and curios performed with thoroughness. Unconscious of her, he stooped and peered in at the blue flames among the coals. He closed the door briskly and made a whirling gesture with his right hand out of pure bliss. He saw her. "Why, hello, old lady. Pretty darn good to be back, eh?" "Yes," she lied, while she quaked. "Not now. I can't face the job of explaining now. He's been so good. He trusts me. And I'm going to break his heart." She smiled at him. She tidied his sacred cellar by throwing an empty bluing bottle into the trash bin. She mourned, "It's only the baby that holds me. If Hugh died—" She fled upstairs in panic and made sure that nothing had happened to Hugh in these 4 minutes. She saw a pencil mark on the windowsill. She had made it on a September day when she had been planning a picnic for Fern Mullins and Eric. Fern and she had been hysterical with nonsense, had invented mad parties for all the coming winter.
She glanced across the alley at the room which Fern had occupied. A rag of a gray curtain masked the still window. She tried to think of someone to whom she wanted to telephone. There was no one. The Sam Clarks called that evening and encouraged her to describe the missions. A dozen times they told her how glad they were to have her back. "It is good to be wanted," she thought. "It will drug me. But... oh, is all life always an unresolved but?" End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. 1. She tried to be content, which was a contradiction in terms. She fanatically cleaned house all April. She knitted a sweater for Hugh. She was diligent at Red Cross work. She was silent when Vida raved that, though America hated war as much as ever, we must invade Germany and wipe out every man, because it was now proven that there was no soldier in the German army who was not crucifying prisoners and cutting off babies' hands. Carol was volunteer nurse when Mrs. Champ Perry suddenly died of pneumonia. In her funeral procession were the 11 people left out of the Grand Army and the Territorial Pioneers, old men and women, very old and weak, who a few decades ago had been boys and girls of the frontier, riding broncos through the rank, windy grass of this prairie. They hobbled behind a band made up of businessmen and high school boys, who straggled along without uniforms or ranks or leader, trying to play Chopin's funeral march, a shabby group of neighbors with grave eyes stumbling through the slush under a solemnity of faltering music. Champ was broken. His rheumatism was worse. The rooms over the store were silent. He could not do his work as buyer at the elevator. Farmers coming in with sled-loads of wheat complained that Champ could not read the scale, that he seemed always to be watching someone back in the darkness of the bins. He was seen slipping through alleys, talking to himself, trying to avoid observation, creeping at last to the cemetery. Once Carol followed him and found the coarse, tobacco-stained, unimaginative old man lying on the snow of the grave, his thick arms spread out across the raw mound as if to protect her from the cold, her whom he had carefully covered up every night for 60 years, who was alone there now, uncared for. The elevator company, Ezra Stowbody president, let him go. The company, Ezra explained to Carol, had no funds for giving pensions. She tried to have him appointed to the postmastership, which, since all the work was done by assistants, was the one sinecure in town, the one reward for political purity. But it proved that Mr. Bert Tybee, the former bartender, desired the postmastership. At her solicitation, Lyman Cass gave Champ a warm berth as night watchman. Small boys played a good many tricks on Champ when he fell asleep at the mill. 2. She had a vicarious happiness in the return of Major Raymond Wutherspoon. He was well, but still weak from having been gassed. He had been discharged and come home as the first of the war veterans. It was rumored that he surprised Vida by coming unannounced, that Vida fainted when she saw him, and for a night and day would not share him with the town. When Carol saw them, Vida was hazy about everything except Raymie, and never went so far from him that she could not slip her hand under his. Without understanding why Carol was troubled by this intensity. And Raymie, surely this was not Raymie, but a sterner brother of his, this man with the tight blouse, the shoulder emblems, the trim legs in boots. His face seemed different, his lips more tight. He was not Raymie, he was Major Wutherspoon, and Kennicott and Carol were grateful when he divulged that Paris wasn't half as pretty as Minneapolis, that all of the American soldiers had been distinguished by their morality when on leave. Kennicott was respectful as he inquired whether the Germans had good aeroplanes, and what a salient was, and a cootie, and going west. In a week Major Wutherspoon was made full manager of the Bon Ton. Harry Haydock was going to devote himself to the half-dozen branch stores which he was establishing at Crossroads Hamlets. Harry would be the town's rich man in the coming generation, and Major Weatherspoon would rise with him. And Vida was jubilant, though she was regretful at having to give up most of her Red Cross work. Ray still needed nursing, she explained. When Carol saw him with his uniform off, in a pepper-and-salt suit and a new gray felt hat, she was disappointed. He was not Major Weatherspoon, he was Ramey. For a month, small boys followed him down the street, and everybody called him Major. But that was presently shortened to Mage, and the small boys did not look up from their marbles as he went by. 3. The town was booming, as a result of the war price of wheat. The wheat money did not remain in the pockets of the farmers. The towns existed to take care of all that. Iowa farmers were selling their land at $400 an acre and coming into Minnesota. But whoever bought or sold or mortgaged, the townsmen invited themselves to the feast. Millers, real estate men, lawyers, merchants, and Dr. Will Kennicott. They bought land at $150, sold it next day at $170, and bought again. In 3 months, Kennicott made $7,000, which was rather more than 4 times as much as society paid him for healing the sick. In early summer began a campaign of boosting. The commercial club decided that Gopher Prairie was not only a wheat center, but also the perfect site for factories, summer cottages, and state institutions. In charge of the campaign was Mr. James Blosser, who had recently come to town to speculate in land. Mr. Blosser was known as a hustler. He liked to be called Honest Jim. He was a bulky, gauche, noisy, humorous man, with narrow eyes, a rustic complexion, large red hands, and brilliant clothes. He was attentive to all women. He was the first man in town who had not been sensitive enough to feel Carol's aloofness. He put his arm about her shoulder while he condescended to Kennicott. "Nice little wifey, I'll say, Doc." And when she answered, not warmly, "Thank you very much for the imprimatur," he blew on her neck, and did not know that he had been insulted. He was a layer-on of hands. He never came to the house without trying to paw her. He touched her arm, let his fist brush her side. She hated the man, and she was afraid of him. She wondered if he had heard of Eric, and was taking advantage. She spoke ill of him at home and in public places, but Kennicott and the other powers insisted, "Maybe he is kind of a roughneck, but you got to hand it to him. He's got more get-up-and-get than any fellow that ever hit this burg. And he's pretty cute, too. Hear what he said to old Ezra? Chucked him in the ribs and said, 'Say, boy, what do you want to go to Denver for? Wait till I get time and I'll move the mountains here. Any mountain will be tickled to death to locate here once we get the White Way in.'" The town welcomed Mr. Blosser as fully as Carol snubbed him. He was the guest of honor at the commercial club banquet at the Minniemashie House, an occasion for menus printed in gold, but injudiciously proofread, for free cigars, soft damp slabs of Lake Superior whitefish served as fillet of sole, drenched cigar ashes gradually filling the saucers of coffee cups, and oratorical references to pep, punch, go, vigor, enterprise, red blood, he-men, fair women, God's country, James J. Hill, the blue sky, the green fields, the bountiful harvest, increasing population, fair return on investments, alien agitators who threaten the security of our institutions, the hearthstone, the foundation of the state, Senator Knute Nelson, 100%, Americanism and pointing with pride. Harry Haydock, as chairman, introduced Honest Jim Blosser. "And I am proud to say, my fellow citizens, that in his brief stay here Mr. Blosser has become my warm personal friend as well as my fellow booster, and I advise you all to very carefully attend to the hints of a man who knows how to achieve." Mr. Blosser reared up like an elephant with a camel's neck, red-faced, red-eyed, heavy-fisted, slightly belching. A born leader, divinely intended to be a congressman, but deflected to the more lucrative honors of real estate. He smiled on his warm personal friends and fellow boosters and boomed,
I certainly was astonished in the streets of our lovely little city the other day. I met the meanest kind of critter that God ever made, meaner than the horned toad or the Texas Lollapalooza. Laughter. And do you know what the animile was? He was a knocker. Laughter and applause. I want to tell you good people, and it's just as sure as God made little apples, the thing that distinguishes our American Commonwealth from the pikers and tin horns in other countries is our punch. You take a genuine, honest-to-God Homo Americanibus, and there ain't anything he's afraid to tackle. Snap and speed are his middle name. He'll put her across if he has to ride from hell to breakfast, and believe me, I'm mighty good and sorry for the boob that's so unlucky as to get in his way, because that poor slob is going to wonder where he was at when old Mr. Cyclone hit town. Laughter. Now, friends, there's some folks so yellow and small and so few in the pod that they go to work and claim that those of us that have the big vision are off our trolleys. They say we can't make Gopher Prairie, God bless her, just as big as Minneapolis or St. Paul or Duluth. But let me tell you right here and now that there ain't a town under the blue canopy of heaven that's got a better chance to take a run and jump and go scooting right up into the 200,000 class than little old GP. And if there's anybody that's got such cold kismets that he's afraid to tag after Jim Blosser on the big going up, then we don't want him here. Way I figure it, you folks are just patriotic enough so that you ain't going to stand for any guy sneering and knocking his own town, no matter how much of a smart aleck he is. And just on the side, I want to add that this Farmers Nonpartisan League and the whole bunch of socialists are right in the same category, or as the fellow says, in the same scategory, meaning this way out, exit, beat it while the going's good, this means you, for all the knockers of prosperity and the rights of property. Fellow citizens, there's a lot of folks, even right here in this fair state, fairest and richest of all the glorious Union, that stand up on their hind legs and claim that the East and Europe put it all over the golden Northwest land. Now let me nail that lie right here and now. Aha, says they, so Jim Blosser is claiming that Gopher Prairie is as good a place to live in as London and Rome and all the rest of the big burgs, is he? How does the poor fish know, says they. Well, I'll tell you how I know. I've seen 'em. I've done Europe from soup to nuts. They can't spring that stuff on Jim Blosser and get away with it. And let me tell you that the only live thing in Europe is our boys that are fighting there now. London. I spent 3 days, 16 straight hours a day, giving London the once-over. And let me tell you that it's nothing but a bunch of fog and out-of-date buildings that no live American burg would stand for 1 minute. You may not believe it, but there ain't one first-class skyscraper in the whole works. And the same thing goes for that crowd of crabs and snobs down east. And the next time you hear some zov from Yahooville on the Hudson chewing the rag and bullying and trying to get your goat, you tell him that no two-fisted, enterprising Westerner would have New York for a gift. Now, the point of this is, I'm not only insisting that Gopher Prairie is going to be Minnesota's pride, the brightest ray in the glory of the North Star State, but also and furthermore that it is right now, and still more shall be, as good a place to live in and love in and bring up the little ones in, and it's got as much refinement and culture as any burg on the whole bloomin' expanse of God's green footstool. And that goes, get me? That goes! Half an hour later, Chairman Haydock moved a vote of thanks to Mr. Blosser. The boosters' campaign was on. The town sought that efficient and modern variety of fame which is known as publicity. The band was reorganized and provided by the commercial club with uniforms of purple and gold. The amateur baseball team hired a semi-professional pitcher from Des Moines and made a schedule of games with every town for 50 miles about. The citizens accompanied it as rooters in a special car, with banners lettered, "Watch Gopher Prairie Grow," and with the band playing "Smile, Smile, Smile." Whether the team won or lost, the Dauntless loyally shrieked, "Boost, boys, and boost together! Put Gopher Prairie on the map!
Brilliant record of our matchless team." Then, glory of glories, the town put in a white way. White ways were in fashion in the Middle West. They were composed of ornamented posts with clusters of high-powered electric lights along 2 or 3 blocks on Main Street. The Dauntless confessed, "White way is installed. Town lit up like Broadway. Speech by Honorable James Blosser. Come on, you Twin Cities. Our hat is in the ring." The Commercial Club issued a booklet prepared by a great and expensive literary person from a Minneapolis advertising agency, a red-headed young man who smoked cigarettes in a long amber holder. Carol read the booklet with a certain wonder. She learned that Plover and Minniemashie Lakes were world-famed for their beauteous wooded shores and gamey pike and bass not to be equaled elsewhere in the entire country. That the residences of Gopher Prairie were models of dignity, comfort, and culture, with lawns and gardens known far and wide. That the Gopher Prairie Schools and Public Library, in its neat and commodious building, were celebrated throughout the state. That the Gopher Prairie mills made the best flour in the country. That the surrounding farmlands were renowned, where'er men ate bread and butter, for their incomparable #1 hard wheat and Holstein Friesian cattle. And that the stores in Gopher Prairie compared favorably with Minneapolis and Chicago in their abundance of luxuries and necessities and the ever-courteous attention of the skilled clerks. She learned, in brief, that this was the one logical location for factories and wholesale houses. "There's where I want to go, to that model town Gopher Prairie," said Carol. Kennicott was triumphant when the Commercial Club did capture one small, shy factory which planned to make wooden automobile wheels, but when Carol saw the promoter she could not feel that his coming much mattered, and a year after, when he failed, she could not be very sorrowful. Retired farmers were moving into town. The price of lots had increased a third. But Carol could discover no more pictures, nor interesting food, nor gracious voices, nor amusing conversation, nor questing minds. She could, she asserted, endure a shabby but modest town. The town shabby and egomaniac she could not endure. She could nurse Champ Perry and warm to the neighborliness of Sam Clark, but she could not sit applauding honest Jim Blosser. Kennicott had begged her, in courtship days, to convert the town to beauty. If it was now as beautiful as Mr. Blosser and the Dauntless said, then her work was over and she could go. End of Chapter 35. Chapter 36, Of Main Street, by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. 1. Kennicott was not so inhumanly patient that he could continue to forgive Carol's heresies, to woo her as he had on the venture to California. She tried to be inconspicuous, but she was betrayed by her failure to glow over the boosting. Kennicott believed in it, demanded that she say patriotic things about the White Way and the new factory. He snorted, "By golly, I've done all I could, and now I expect you to play the game. Here you've been complaining for years about us being so poky, and now when Blosser comes along and does stir up excitement and beautify the town like you've always wanted somebody to, why, you say he's a roughneck, and you won't jump on the bandwagon." Once, when Kennicott announced at noon dinner, "What do you know about this? They say there's a chance we may get another factory, cream separator works," he added, "You might try to look interested even if you ain't." The baby was frightened by the Jovian roar, ran wailing to hide his face in Carol's lap, and Kennicott had to make himself humble and court both mother and child. The dim injustice of not being understood even by his son left him irritable. He felt injured. An event which did not directly touch them brought down his wrath. In the early autumn, news came from Waukeman that the sheriff had forbidden an organizer for the National Nonpartisan League to speak anywhere in the county. The organizer had defied the sheriff and announced that in a few days he would address a farmers' political meeting. That night, the news ran, a mob of 100 businessmen, led by the sheriff, The tame village street and the smug village faces ruddled by the light of bobbing lanterns, the mob flowing between the squatty rows of shops, had taken the organizer from his hotel, ridden him on a fence rail, put him on a freight train, and warned him not to return. The story was threshed out in Dave Dyer's drugstore, with Sam Clark, Kennicott, and Carol present. "That's the way you treat those fellows. Only they ought to have lynched him," declared Sam, and Kennicott and Dave Dyer joined in a proud, "You bet." Carol walked out hastily, Kennicott observing her. Through supper-time she knew that he was bubbling and would soon boil over. When the baby was abed, and they sat composedly in canvas chairs on the porch, he experimented. "I had a hunch you thought Sam was kind of hard on that fellow they kicked out of Waukeman." "Wasn't Sam rather needlessly heroic?" "All these organizers, yes, and a whole lot of the German and square-head farmers themselves, they're seditious as the devil. Disloyal, non-patriotic, pro-German pacifists, that's what they are." "Did this organizer say anything pro-German?" "Not on your life. They didn't give him a chance." His laugh was stagey. "So the whole thing was illegal, and led by the sheriff. Precisely how do you expect these aliens to obey your law if the officer of the law teaches them to break it? Is it a new kind of logic?" "Maybe it wasn't exactly regular, but what's the odds? They knew this fellow would try to stir up trouble. Whenever it comes right down to a question of defending Americanism and our constitutional rights, it's justifiable to set aside ordinary procedure." What editorial did he get that from, she wondered, as she protested. "See here, my beloved, why can't you Tories declare war honestly? You don't oppose this organizer because you think he's seditious, but because you're afraid that the farmers he is organizing will deprive you townsmen of the money you make out of mortgages and weed and shops. Of course, since we're at war with Germany, anything that any one of us doesn't like is pro-German, whether it's business competition or bad music. If we were fighting England, you'd call the radicals pro-English. When this war is over, I suppose you'll be calling them red anarchists. What an eternal art it is! Such a glittery, delightful art! Finding hard names for our opponents. How we do sanctify our efforts to keep them from getting the holy dollars we want for ourselves. The churches have always done it, and the political orators, and I suppose I do it when I call Mrs. Bogart a Puritan and Mr. Stowbody a capitalist. But you businessmen are going to beat all the rest of us at it with your simple-hearted, energetic, pompous—" She got so far only because Kennicott was slow in shaking off respect for her. Now he bade, "That'll be about all from you. I've stood for your sneering at this town and saying how ugly and dull it is. I've stood for your refusing to appreciate good fellows like Sam. I've even stood for your ridiculing our Watch Gopher Prairie Grow campaign. But one thing I'm not going to stand. I'm not going to stand my own wife being seditious. You can camouflage all you want to, but you know darn well that these radicals, as you call 'em, are opposed to the war, and let me tell you right here and now, you and all these long-haired men and short-haired women can beef all you want to. But we're going to take these fellows, and if they ain't patriotic, we're going to make them be patriotic. And, Lord knows, I never thought I'd have to say this to my own wife, but if you go defending these fellows, then the same thing applies to you. Next thing, I suppose you'll be yapping about free speech. Free speech! There's too much free speech and free gas and free beer and free love and all the rest of your damned mouthy freedom. And if I had my way, I'd make you folks live up to the established rules of decency even if I had to take you— Will— She was not timorous now. Am I pro-German if I fail to throb to honest Jim Blosser, too? Let's have my whole duty as a wife." He was grumbling. "The whole thing's right in line with the criticism you've always been making. Might have known you'd oppose any decent constructive work for the town or for— You're right. All I've done has been in line. I don't belong to Gopher Prairie. That isn't meant as a condemnation of Gopher Prairie, and it may be a condemnation of me. All right,
I don't care. I don't belong here, and I'm going. I'm not asking permission any more. I'm simply going."
He grunted. "Do you mind telling me, if it isn't too much trouble, how long you're going for?"
"I don't know. Perhaps for a year, perhaps for a lifetime."
"I see. Well, of course, I'll be tickled to death to sell out my practice and go anywhere you say. Would you like to have me go with you to Paris and study art, maybe, and wear velveteen pants and a woman's bonnet, and live on spaghetti?"
"No, I think we can save you that trouble. You don't quite understand. I am going. I really am. And alone. I've got to find out what my work is."
"Work? Work? Sure, that's the whole trouble with you. You haven't got enough work to do. If you had 5 kids and no hired girl, and had to help with the chores and separate the cream, like these farmers' wives, then you wouldn't be so discontented."
"I know. That's what most men, and women like you, would say. That's how they would explain all I am and all I want. And I shouldn't argue with them. These businessmen, from their crushing labors of sitting in an office 7 hours a day, would calmly recommend that I have a dozen children. As it happens, I've done that sort of thing. There have been a good many times when we hadn't a maid, and I did all the housework, and cared for Hugh, and went to Red Cross, and did it all very efficiently. I'm a good cook and a good sweeper, and don't you dare say I'm not."
"No, you're—"
"But was I more happy when I was drudging? I was not. I was just bedraggled and unhappy. It's work, but not my work. I could run an office or a library, or nurse and teach children, but solitary dishwashing isn't enough to satisfy me, or many other women. We're going to chuck it. We're going to wash 'em by machinery, and come out and play with you men in the offices and clubs and politics you've cleverly kept for yourselves. Oh, we're hopeless, we dissatisfied women. Then why do you want to have us about the place to fret you? So it's for your sake that I'm going."
"Of course, a little thing like Hugh makes no difference."
"Yes, all the difference. That's why I'm going to take him with me."
"Suppose I refuse?"
"You won't."
Forlornly,
Carrie, what the devil is it you want, anyway?" "Oh, conversation. No, it's much more than that. I think it's a greatness of life, a refusal to be content with even the healthiest mud."
"Don't you know that nobody ever solved a problem by running away from it?"
"Perhaps. Only I choose to make my own definition of running away. I don't call— Do you realize how big a world there is beyond this Gopher Prairie where you'd keep me all my life? It may be that some day I'll come back, but not till I can bring something more than I have now. And even if I am cowardly and run away, all right, call it cowardly. Call me anything you want to. I've been ruled too long by fear of being called things. I'm going away to be quiet and think. I'm going. I have a right to my own life."
"So have I to mine."
"Well?"
"I have a right to my life, and you're it. You're my life. You've made yourself so. I'm damned if I'll agree to all your freak notions, but I will say I've got to depend on you. Never thought of that complication, did you, in this off to Bohemia and express yourself and free love and live your own life stuff?"
"You have a right to me if you can keep me. Can you?"
He moved uneasily. 2.
For a month they discussed it. They hurt each other very much, and sometimes they were close to weeping, and invariably he used banal phrases about her duties, and she used phrases quite as banal about freedom, and through it all her discovery that she really could get away from Main Street was as sweet as the discovery of love. Kennicott never consented definitely. At most, he agreed to a public theory that she was going to take a short trip and see what the East was like in wartime. She set out for Washington in October, just before the war ended. She had determined on Washington because it was less intimidating than the obvious New York, because she hoped to find streets in which Hugh could play, and because in the stress of war work
With its demand for thousands of temporary clerks, she could be initiated into the world of offices. Hugh was to go with her, despite the wails and rather extensive comments of Aunt Bessie. She wondered if she might not encounter Eric in the East, but it was a chance thought, soon forgotten. 3. The last thing she saw on the station platform was Kennicott, faithfully waving his hand, his face so full of uncomprehending loneliness that he could not smile but only twitch up his lips. She waved to him as long as she could, and when he was lost she wanted to leap from the vestibule and run back to him. She thought of 100 tendernesses she had neglected. She had her freedom, and it was empty. The moment was not the highest of her life, but the lowest and most desolate, which was altogether excellent, for instead of slipping downward, she began to climb. She sighed. I couldn't do this if it weren't for Will's kindness, his giving me money. But a second after, I wonder how many women would always stay home if they had the money. Hugh complained. Notice me, Mummy. He was beside her on the red plush seat of the day coach, a boy of 3.5. I'm tired of playing train. Let's play something else. Let's go see Auntie Bogart. Oh, no. Do you really like Mrs. Bogart? Yes. She gives me cookies, and she tells me about the dear Lord. You never tell me about the dear Lord. Why don't you tell me about the dear Lord? Auntie Bogart says I'm going to be a preacher. Can I be a preacher? Can I preach about the dear Lord? Oh, please wait till my generation has stopped rebelling before yours starts in. What's a generation? It's a ray in the illumination of the Spirit. That's foolish. He was a serious and literal person, and rather humorless. She kissed his frown and marveled. I am running away from my husband, after liking a Swedish ne'er-do-well and expressing immoral opinions, just as in a romantic story. And my own son reproves me because I haven't given him religious instruction. But the story doesn't go right. I'm neither groaning nor being dramatically saved. I keep on running away, and I enjoy it. I'm mad with joy over it. Gopher Prairie is lost back there in the dust and stubble, and I look forward. She continued it to Hugh. Darling, do you know what Mother and you are going to find beyond the blue horizon rim? What? Flatly. We're going to find elephants with golden howdahs, from which peep young Maharanis with necklaces of rubies, and a dawn sea colored like the breast of a dove, and a white and green house filled with books and silver tea sets. And cookies? Cookies? Oh, most decidedly cookies. We've had enough of bread and porridge. We get sick on too many cookies, but ever so much sicker on no cookies at all. That's foolish. It is, O male Kennicott. Huh, said Kennicott II, and went to sleep on her shoulder. 4. The theory of the Dauntless regarding Carol's absence. Mrs. Will Kennicott and son Hugh left on number 24 on Saturday last for a stay of some months in Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, and Washington. Mrs. Kennicott confided to Ye Scribe that she will be connected with one of the multifarious war activities now centering in the nation's capital for a brief period before returning. Her countless friends who appreciate her splendid labors with the local Red Cross realize how valuable she will be to any war board with which she chooses to become connected. Gopher Prairie thus adds another shining star to its service flag, and without wishing to knock any neighboring communities, we would like to know any town of anywheres near our size in the state that has such a sterling war record. Another reason why you'd better watch Gopher Prairie grow. Mr. and Mrs. David Dyer, Mrs. Dyer's sister, Mrs. Jenny Dayborn of Jack Rabbit, and Dr. Will Kennicott drove to Minniemashie on Tuesday for a delightful picnic. End of Chapter 36. Chapter 37, Of Main Street, by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. 1. She found employment in the Bureau of War Risk Insurance. Though the armistice with Germany was signed a few weeks after her coming to Washington, the work of the Bureau continued. She filed correspondence all day. Then she dictated answers to letters of inquiry. It was an endurance of monotonous details, yet she asserted that she had found real work. Disillusions she did have. She discovered that in the afternoon, office routine stretches to the grave. She discovered that an office is as full of cliques and scandals as a Gopher Prairie. She discovered that most of the women in the government bureaus lived unhealthfully, dining on snatches in their crammed apartments. But she also discovered that businesswomen may have friendships and enmities as frankly as men, and may revel in a bliss which no housewife attains, a free Sunday. It did not appear that the great world needed her inspiration, but she felt that her letters, her contact with the anxieties of men and women all over the country, were a part of vast affairs, not confined to Main Street and a kitchen, but linked with Paris, Bangkok, Madrid. She perceived that she could do office work without losing any of the putative feminine virtue of domesticity, that cooking and cleaning, when divested of the fussing of an Aunt Bessie, take but 1/10 of the time which in a Gopher Prairie it is but decent to devote to them. Not to have to apologize for her thoughts to the Jolly 17, not to have to report to Kennicott at the end of the day all that she had done or might do, was a relief which made up for the office weariness. She felt that she was no longer one half of a marriage, but the whole of a human being. 2. Washington gave her all the graciousness in which she had had faith. White columns seen across leafy parks, spacious avenues, twisty alleys. Daily she passed a dark square house with a hint of magnolias and a courtyard behind it, and a tall curtained second-story window through which a woman was always peering. The woman was mystery, romance, a story which told itself differently every day. Now she was a murderess, now the neglected wife of an ambassador. It was mystery which Carol had most lacked in Gopher Prairie, where every house was open to view, where every person was but too easy to meet, where there were no secret gates opening upon moors over which one might walk by moss-deadened paths to strange high adventures in an ancient garden. As she flitted up 16th Street after a Chrysler recital given late in the afternoon for the government clerks, as the lamps kindled in spheres of soft fire, as the breeze flowed into the street, fresh as prairie winds and kindlier, as she glanced up the elm alley of Massachusetts Avenue, as she was rested by the integrity of the Scottish Rite Temple, she loved the city as she loved no one save Hugh. She encountered Negro shanties turned into studios, with orange curtains and pots of mignonette, marble houses on New Hampshire Avenue, with butlers and limousines, and men who looked like fictional explorers and aviators. Her days were swift, and she knew that in her folly of running away she had found the courage to be wise. She had a dispiriting first month of hunting lodgings in the crowded city. She had to roost in a hall-room in a mouldy mansion conducted by an indignant, decayed gentlewoman, and leave Hugh to the care of a doubtful nurse. But later she made a home. 3. Her first acquaintances were the members of the Tincombe Methodist Church, a vast red-brick tabernacle. Vida Sherwin had given her a letter to an earnest woman with eyeglasses, plaid silk waist, and a belief in Bible classes, who introduced her to the pastor and the nicer members of Tincombe. Carol recognized in Washington, as she had in California, a transplanted and guarded Main Street. 2/3 of the church members had come from Gopher Prairies. The church was their society and their standard. They went to Sunday service, Sunday school, Christian Endeavor, missionary lectures, church suppers, precisely as they had at home. They agreed that ambassadors and flippant newspapermen and infidel scientists of the bureaus were equally wicked and to be avoided. And by cleaving to Tincombe Church they kept their ideals from all contamination. They welcomed Carol, asked about her husband, gave her advice regarding colic in babies, passed her the gingerbread and scalloped potatoes at church suppers, and in general made her very unhappy and lonely, so that she wondered if she might not enlist in the militant suffrage organization and be allowed to go to jail. Always she was to perceive in Washington, as doubtless she would have perceived in New York or London, a thick streak of Main Street. The cautious dullness of a Gopher Prairie appeared in boarding-houses where ladylike bureau clerks gossiped to polite young army officers about the movies. 1,000 Sam Clarks and a few Widow Bogarts were to be identified in the Sunday motor procession, in theater parties, and at the dinners of state societies, to which the émigrés from Texas or Michigan surged that they might confirm themselves in the faith that their several Gopher Prairies were notoriously a whole lot peppier and chummier than this stuck-up East. But she found a Washington which did not cleave to Main Street. Guy Pollock wrote to a cousin, a temporary army captain, a confiding and buoyant lad who took Carol to tea dances and laughed, as she had always wanted someone to laugh, about nothing in particular. The captain introduced her to the secretary of a congressman, a cynical young widow with many acquaintances in the Navy. Through her, Carol met commanders and majors, newspapermen, chemists and geographers, and fiscal experts from the bureaus, and a teacher who was a familiar of the militant suffrage headquarters. The teacher took her to headquarters. Carol never became a prominent suffragist. Indeed, her only recognized position was as an able addresser of envelopes. But she was casually adopted by this family of friendly women, who, when they were not being mobbed or arrested, took dancing lessons or went picnicking up the Chesapeake Canal, or talked about the politics of the American Federation of Labor. With the congressman's secretary and the teacher, Carol leased a small flat. Here she found home, her own place and her own people. She had, though it absorbed most of her salary, an excellent nurse for Hugh. She herself put him to bed and played with him on holidays. There were walks with him, there were motionless evenings of reading, but chiefly Washington was associated with people, scores of them, sitting about the flat, talking, not always wisely, but always excitedly. It was not at all the artist's studio of which, because of its persistence in fiction, she had dreamed. Most of them were in offices all day, and thought more in card catalogues or statistics than in mass and color. But they played, very simply, and they saw no reason why anything which exists cannot also be acknowledged. She was sometimes shocked, quite as she had shocked Gopher Prairie, by these girls with their cigarettes and elfish knowledge. When they were most eager about Soviets or canoeing, she listened, longed to have some special learning which would distinguish her, and sighed that her adventure had come so late. Kennicott and Main Street had drained her self-reliance. The presence of Hugh made her feel temporary. Some day, oh, she'd have to take him back to open fields and the right to climb about haylofts. But the fact that she could never be eminent among these scoffing enthusiasts did not keep her from being proud of them, from defending them in imaginary conversations with Kennicott, who grunted, she could hear his voice, "They're simply a bunch of wild, impractical theorists sitting around chewing the rag," and "I haven't got the time to chase after a lot of these fool fads. I'm too busy putting aside a stake for our old age." Most of the men who came to the flat, whether they were army officers or radicals who hated the army, had the easy gentleness, the acceptance of women without embarrassed banter, for which she had longed in Gopher Prairie. Yet they seemed to be as efficient as the Sam Clarks. She concluded that it was because they were of secure reputation, not hemmed in by the fire of provincial jealousies. Kennicott had asserted that the villager's lack of courtesy is due to his poverty. "We're no millionaire dudes," he boasted. Yet these Army and Navy men, these bureau experts, and organizers of multitudinous leagues were cheerful on 3,000 or 4,000 a year, while Kennicott had, outside of his land speculations, 6,000 or more, and Sam had 8. Nor could she upon inquiry learn that many of this reckless race died in the poorhouse. That institution is reserved for people like Kennicott, who, after devoting 50 years to putting aside a stake, incontinently invest the stake in spurious oil stocks. 4. She was encouraged to believe that she had not been abnormal in viewing Gopher Prairie as unduly tedious and slatternly. She found the same faith not only in girls escaped from domesticity, but also in demure old ladies, who, tragically deprived of esteemed husbands and huge old houses, yet managed to make a very comfortable thing of it by living in small flats and having time to read. But she also learned that, by comparison, Gopher Prairie was a model of daring color, clever planning, and frenzied intellectuality. From her teacher housemate, she had a sardonic description of a Middle Western Railroad division town, of the same size as Gopher Prairie, but devoid of lawns and trees, a town where the tracks sprawled along the cinder-scabbed Main Street, and the railroad shops, dripping soot from eaves and doorway, rolled out smoke in greasy coils. Other towns she came to know by anecdote: a prairie village where the wind blew all day long, and the mud was 2 feet thick in spring, and in summer the flying sand scarred new-painted houses and dust covered the few flowers set out in pots. New England mill towns with the hands living in rows of cottages like blocks of lava. A rich farming center in New Jersey, off the railroad, furiously pious, ruled by old men, unbelievably ignorant old men, sitting about the grocery talking of James G. Blaine. A southern town, full of the magnolias and white columns which Carol had accepted as proof of romance, but hating the Negroes, obsequious to the old families. A western mining settlement like a tumor. A booming semi-city with parks and clever architects, visited by famous pianists and unctuous lecturers, but irritable from a struggle between union labor and the Manufacturers' Association, so that in even the gayest of the new houses there was a ceaseless and intimidating heresy hunt. 5. The chart which plots Carol's progress is not easy to read. The lines are broken and uncertain of direction. Often, instead of rising, they sink in wavering scrawls, and the colors are watery blue and pink and the dim gray of rubbed pencil marks. A few lines are traceable. Unhappy women are given to protecting their sensitiveness by cynical gossip, by whining, by high church and New Thought religions, or by a fog of vagueness. Carol had hidden in none of these refuges from reality, but she, who was tender and merry, had been made timorous by Gopher Prairie. Even her flight had been but the temporary courage of panic. The thing she gained in Washington was not information about office systems and labor unions, but renewed courage, that amiable contempt called poise. Her glimpse of tasks involving millions of people and a score of nations reduced Main Street from bloated importance to its actual pettiness. She could never again be quite so awed by the power with which she herself had endowed the Vidas and Blossers and Bogarts. From her work, and from her association with women who had organized suffrage associations in hostile cities or had defended political prisoners, she caught something of an impersonal attitude, saw that she had been as touchily personal as Maud Dyer. And why, she began to ask, did she rage at individuals? Not individuals, but institutions are the enemies, and they most afflict the disciples who the most generously serve them. They insinuate their tyranny under 100 guises and pompous names, such as polite society, the family, the church, sound business, the party, the country, the superior white race, and the only defense against them, Carol beheld, is unembittered laughter. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. 1. She had lived in Washington for a year. She was tired of the office. It was tolerable, far more tolerable than housework, but it was not adventurous. She was having tea and cinnamon toast, alone at a small round table on the balcony of Rosher's Confiserie. 4 debutantes clattered in. She had felt young and dissipated, had thought rather well of her black and leaf-green suit, but as she watched them, thin of ankle, soft under the chin, 17 or 18 at most, smoking cigarettes with the correct ennui and talking of bedroom farces and their desire to run up to New York and see something racy, she became old and rustic and plain, and desirous of retreating from these hard, brilliant children to a life easier and more sympathetic. When they flickered out and one child gave orders to a chauffeur, Carol was not a defiant philosopher, but a faded government clerk from Gopher Prairie, Minnesota. She started dejectedly up Connecticut Avenue. She stopped. Her heart stopped. Coming toward her were Harry and Juanita Haydock. She ran to them. She kissed Juanita while Harry confided, "Hadn't expected to come to Washington. Had to go to New York for some buying. Didn't have your address along. Just got in this morning. Wondered how in the world we could get hold of you." She was definitely sorry to hear that they were to leave at 9 that evening, and she clung to them as long as she could. She took them to St. Mark's for dinner. Stooped, her elbows on the table, she heard with excitement that Cy Bogart had the flu, but of course he was too gall-darn mean to die of it. "Will wrote me that Mr. Blosser has gone away. How did he get on?" "Fine, fine. Great loss to the town. There was a real public-spirited fellow, all right." She discovered that she now had no opinions whatever about Mr. Blosser, and she said sympathetically, "Will you keep up the town-boosting campaign?" Harry fumbled. "Well, we've dropped it just temporarily, but sure, you bet. Say, did the doc write you about the luck B.J. Gogerling had hunting ducks down in Texas?" When the news had been told and their enthusiasm had slackened, she looked about and was proud to be able to point out a senator, to explain the cleverness of the canopied garden. She fancied that a man with dinner coat and waxed mustache glanced superciliously at Harry's highly form-fitting bright brown suit and Juanita's tan silk frock, which was doubtful at the seams. She glared back, defending her own, daring the world not to appreciate them. Then, waving to them, she lost them down the long train shed. She stood reading the list of stations: Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Chicago. Beyond Chicago? She saw the lakes and stubble fields, heard the rhythm of insects and the creak of a buggy, was greeted by Sam Clark's, "Well, well, how's the little lady?" Nobody in Washington cared enough for her to fret about her sins as Sam did. But that night they had at the flat a man just back from Finland. 2. She was on the Powhatan roof with the captain. At a table, somewhat vociferously buying improbable soft drinks for 2 fluffy girls, was a man with a large, familiar back. "Oh, I think I know him," she murmured. "Who, there? Oh, Bresnahan, Percy Bresnahan." "Yes, you've met him. What sort of a man is he?" "He's a good-hearted idiot. I rather like him, and I believe that as a salesman of motors he's a wonder. But he's a nuisance in the aeronautics section. Tries so hard to be useful, but he doesn't know anything. He doesn't know anything. Rather pathetic. Rich man poking around and trying to be useful. Do you want to speak to him?" No, I don't think so." 3. She was at a motion picture show. The film was a highly advertised and abysmal thing smacking of simpering hairdressers, cheap perfume, red plush suites on the back streets of Tenderloins, and complacent fat women chewing gum. It pretended to deal with the life of studios. The leading man did a portrait which was a masterpiece. He also saw visions in pipe smoke, and was very brave and poor and pure. He had ringlets, and his masterpiece was strangely like an enlarged photograph. Carol prepared to leave. On the screen, in the role of a composer, appeared an actor called Eric Valure. She was startled, incredulous, then wretched. Looking straight out at her, wearing a beret and a velvet jacket, was Eric Valborg. He had a pale part, which he played neither well nor badly. She speculated, "I could have made so much of him." She did not finish her speculation. She went home and read Kennicott's letters. They had seemed stiff and undetailed, but now there strode from them a personality unlike that of the languishing young man in the velvet jacket playing a dummy piano in a canvas room. 4. Kennicott first came to see her in November, 13 months after her arrival in Washington. When he announced that he was coming, she was not at all sure that she wished to see him. She was glad that he had made the decision himself. She had leave from the office for 2 days. She watched him marching from the train, solid, assured, carrying his heavy suitcase, and she was diffident. He was such a bulky person to handle. They kissed each other questioningly and said at the same time, "You're looking fine. How's the baby?" And, "You're looking awfully well, dear. How is everything?" He grumbled, "I don't want to butt in on any plans you've made or your friends or anything, but if you've got time for it, I'd like to chase around Washington and take in some restaurants and shows and stuff, and forget work for a while." She realized, in the taxicab, that he was wearing a soft gray suit, a soft easy hat, a flippant tie. "Like the new outfit? Got 'em in Chicago. Gosh, I hope they're the kind you like." They spent half an hour at the flat with Hugh. She was flustered, but he gave no sign of kissing her again. As he moved about the small rooms, she realized that he had had his new tan shoes polished to a brassy luster. There was a recent cut on his chin. He must have shaved on the train just before coming into Washington. It was pleasant to feel how important she was, how many people she recognized, as she took him to the Capitol. As she told him, he asked and she obligingly guessed, how many feet it was to the top of the dome, as she pointed out Senator La Follette and the Vice President, and at lunchtime showed herself an habitué by leading him through the catacombs to the Senate restaurant. She realized that he was slightly more bald. The familiar way in which his hair was parted on the left side agitated her. She looked down at his hands, and the fact that his nails were as ill-treated as ever touched her more than his pleading shoeshine. "You'd like to motor down to Mount Vernon this afternoon, wouldn't you?" she said. It was the one thing he had planned. He was delighted that it seemed to be a perfectly well-bred and Washingtonian thing to do. He shyly held her hand on the way and told her the news. They were excavating the basement for the new school building. Vida made him tired the way she always looked at the mage. Poor Chet Dashaway had been killed in a motor accident out on the coast. He did not coax her to like him. At Mount Vernon, he admired the paneled library and Washington's dental tools. She knew that he would want oysters, that he would have heard of Harvey's apropos of Grant and Blaine, and she took him there. At dinner, his hearty voice, his holiday enjoyment of everything, turned into nervousness in his desire to know a number of interesting matters, such as whether they were still married. But he did not ask questions, and he said nothing about her returning. He cleared his throat and observed, "Oh, say, been trying out the old camera. Don't you think these are pretty good?" He tossed over to her 30 prints of Gopher Prairie and the country about. Without defense, she was thrown into it. She remembered that he had lured her with photographs in courtship days. She made a note of his sameness, his satisfaction with the tactics which had proved good before, but she forgot it in the familiar places. She was seeing the sun-speckled ferns among birches on the shore of Minniemashie, wind-rippled miles of wheat, the porch of their own house where Hugh had played, Main Street where she knew every window and every face. She handed them back, with praise for his photography, and he talked of lenses and time exposures. Dinner was over, and they were gossiping of her friends at the flat, but an intruder was with them, sitting back, persistent, inescapable. She could not endure it. She stammered, "I had you check your bag at the station, because I wasn't quite sure where you'd stay. I'm dreadfully sorry we haven't room to put you up at the flat. We ought to have seen about a room for you before. Don't you think you better call up the Willard or the Washington now?" He peered at her cloudily. Without words he asked, without speech she answered, whether she was also going to the Willard or the Washington. But she tried to look as though she did not know that they were debating anything of the sort. She would have hated him had he been meek about it, but he was neither meek nor angry. However impatient he may have been with her blandness, he said readily, "Yes, guess I better do that. Excuse me a second. Then how about grabbing a taxi?
Gosh, isn't it the limit the way these taxi shovers skin around a corner? Got more nerve driving than I have. And going up to your flat for a while? Like to meet your friends. Must be fine women, and I might take a look and see how Hugh sleeps. Like to know how he breathes. Don't think he has adenoids, but I better make sure, eh?" He patted her shoulder. At the flat they found her 2 housemates and a girl who had been to jail for suffrage. Kennicott fitted in surprisingly. He laughed at the girl's story of the humors of a hunger strike. He told the secretary what to do when her eyes were tired from typing, and the teacher asked him, not as the husband of a friend but as a physician, whether there was anything to this inoculation for colds. His colloquialism seemed to Carol no more lax than their habitual slang. Like an older brother, he kissed her good night in the midst of the company. "He's terribly nice," said her housemates, and waited for confidences. They got none, nor did her own heart. She could find nothing definite to agonize about. She felt that she was no longer analyzing and controlling forces, but swept on by them. He came to the flat for breakfast and washed the dishes. That was her only occasion for spite. Back home, he never thought of washing dishes. She took him to the obvious sights: the Treasury, the Monument, the Corcoran Gallery, the Pan American Building, the Lincoln Memorial, with the Potomac beyond it, and the Arlington Hills and the columns of the Lee Mansion. For all his willingness to play, there was over him a melancholy which piqued her. His normally expressionless eyes had depth to them now, and strangeness. As they walked through Lafayette Square, looking past the Jackson statue at the lovely, tranquil facade of the White House, he sighed, "I wish I had a shot at places like this. When I was in the U, I had to earn part of my way, and when I wasn't doing that or studying, I guess I was roughhousing. My gang were a great bunch for bumming around and raising Cain. Maybe if I'd been caught early and sent to concerts and all that, would I have been what you call intelligent?" "Oh, my dear, don't be humble. You are intelligent. For instance, you're the most thorough doctor." He was edging about something he wished to say. He pounced on it. "You did like those pictures of GP pretty well, after all, didn't you?" "Yes, of course." "Wouldn't be so bad to have a glimpse of the old town, would it?" "No, it wouldn't. Just as I was terribly glad to see the Haydocks. But please understand me. That doesn't mean that I withdraw all my criticisms. The fact that I might like a glimpse of old friends hasn't any particular relation to the question of whether Gopher Prairie oughtn't to have festivals and lamb chops." Hastily, "No, sure not. I understand." "But I know it must have been pretty tiresome to have to live with anybody as perfect as I was." He grinned. She liked his grin. 5. He was thrilled by old Negro coachmen, admirals, aeroplanes, the building to which his income tax would eventually go, a Rolls-Royce, Lynnhaven oysters, the Supreme Court room, a New York theatrical manager down for the tryout of a play, the house where Lincoln died, the cloaks of Italian officers, the barrows at which clerks buy their lunch boxes at noon, the barges on the Chesapeake Canal, and the fact that District of Columbia cars had both District and Maryland licenses. She resolutely took him to her favorite white and green cottages and Georgian houses. He admitted that fanlights, and white shutters against rosy brick, were more homelike than a painty wooden box. He volunteered, "I see what you mean. They make me think of these pictures of an old-fashioned Christmas. Oh, if you keep at it long enough, you'll have Sam and me reading poetry and everything. Oh, say, did I tell you about this fierce green Jack Elders had his machine painted?" 6. They were at dinner. He hinted, "Before you showed me those places today, I'd already made up my mind that when I built the new house we used to talk about, I'd fix it the way you wanted it. I'm pretty practical about foundations and radiation and stuff like that, but I guess I don't know a whole lot about architecture." "My dear, it occurs to me with a sudden shock that I don't either." "Well, anyway, let me plan the garage and the plumbing, and you do the rest, if you ever want to." Doubtfully, "That's sweet of you."
Look here, Carrie. You think I'm going to ask you to love me. I'm not. And I'm not going to ask you to come back to Gopher Prairie." She gaped. "It's been a whale of a fight. But I guess I've got myself to see that you won't ever stand GP unless you want to come back to it. I needn't say I'm crazy to have you, but I won't ask you. I just want you to know how I wait for you. Every mail I look for a letter, and when I get one, I'm kind of scared to open it. I'm hoping so much that you're coming back. Evenings. You know, I didn't open the cottage down at the lake at all this past summer. Simply couldn't stand all the others laughing and swimming, and you not there. I used to sit on the porch in town, and I couldn't get over the feeling that you simply run up to the drugstore and would be right back, until after it got dark I'd catch myself watching, looking up the street, and you never came, and the house was so empty and still that I didn't like to go in. And sometimes I fell asleep there, in my chair, and didn't wake up till after midnight, and the house— Oh, the devil. Please get me, Carrie. I just want you to know how welcome you'll be if you ever do come. But I'm not asking you to." It's awfully— "Another thing. I'm going to be frank. I haven't always been absolutely proper. I've always loved you more than anything else in the world, you and the kid. But sometimes, when you were chilly to me, I'd get lonely and sore, and pike out and— Never intended." She rescued him with a pitying, "It's all right. Let's forget it. But before we were married, you said if your husband ever did anything wrong, you'd want him to tell you." "Did I? I can't remember, and I can't seem to think. Oh, my dear, I do know how generously you're trying to make me happy. The only thing is, I can't think. I don't know what I think." "Then listen. Don't think. Here's what I want you to do. Get a 2 weeks' leave from your office. Weather's beginning to get chilly here. Let's run down to Charleston and Savannah and maybe Florida." "A second honeymoon?" Indecisively. "No, don't even call it that. Call it a second wooing. I won't ask anything. I just want the chance to chase around with you. I guess I never appreciated how lucky I was to have a girl with imagination and lively feet to play with. So, could you maybe run away and see the South with me? If you wanted to, you could just pretend you were my sister, and I'll get an extra nurse for Hugh. I'll get the best doggone nurse in Washington." 7. It was in the Villa Margarita, by the palms of the Charleston Battery and the metallic harbor, that her aloofness melted. When they sat on the upper balcony, enchanted by the moon glitter, she cried, "Shall I go back to Gopher Prairie with you? Decide for me. I'm tired of deciding and undeciding." "No. You've got to do your own deciding. As a matter of fact, in spite of this honeymoon, I don't think I want you to come home. Not yet." She could only stare. "I want you to be satisfied when you get there. I'll do everything I can to keep you happy, but I'll make lots of breaks, so I want you to take time and think it over." She was relieved. She still had a chance to seize splendid indefinite freedoms. She might go— she'd see Europe somehow, before she was recaptured. But she also had a firmer respect for Kennicott. She had fancied that her life might make a story. She knew that there was nothing heroic or obviously dramatic in it, no magic of rare hours, nor valiant challenge. But it seemed to her that she was of some significance because she was commonplaceness, the ordinary life of the age, made articulate and protesting. It had not occurred to her that there was also a story of Will Kennicott, into which she entered only so much as he entered into hers, that he had bewilderments and concealments as intricate as her own, and soft, treacherous desires for sympathy. Thus she brooded, looking at the amazing sea, holding his hand. 8. She was in Washington. Kennicott was in Gopher Prairie, writing as dryly as ever about water pipes and goose hunting and Mrs. Fageros's mastoid. She was talking at dinner to a generalissima of suffrage. should she return. The leader spoke wearily. "My dear, I'm perfectly selfish. I can't quite visualize the needs of your husband, and it seems to me that your baby will do quite as well in the schools here as in your barracks at home." "Then you think I'd better not go back?" Carol sounded disappointed. "It's more difficult than that. When I say that I'm selfish, I mean that the only thing I consider about women is whether they're likely to prove useful in building up real political power for women. And you, shall I be frank? Remember, when I say you, I don't mean you alone. I'm thinking of thousands of women who come to Washington and New York and Chicago every year, dissatisfied at home and seeking a sign in the heavens. Women of all sorts, from timid mothers of 50 in cotton gloves to girls just out of Vassar who organize strikes in their own father's factories. All of you are more or less useful to me, but only a few of you can take my place, because I have one virtue, only one. I have given up father and mother and children for the love of God. Here's the test for you. Do you come to conquer the East, as people say, or do you come to conquer yourself? It's so much more complicated than any of you know, so much more complicated than I knew when I put on ground grippers and started out to reform the world. The final complication in conquering Washington or conquering New York is that the conquerors must beyond all things not conquer. It must have been so easy in the good old days when authors dreamed of only selling 100,000 volumes, and sculptors of being feted in big houses, and even the uplifters like me had a simple-hearted ambition to be elected to important offices and invited to go around lecturing. But we meddlers have upset everything. Now, the one thing that is disgraceful to any of us is obvious success. The uplifter who is very popular with wealthy patrons can be pretty sure that he has softened his philosophy to please them, and the author who is making lots of money, poor things, I've heard him apologizing for it to the shabby bitter enders. I've seen him ashamed of the sleek luggage they got from movie rights. Do you want to sacrifice yourself in such a topsy-turvy world, where popularity makes you unpopular with the people you love, and the only failure is cheap success, and the only individualist is the person who gives up all his individualism to serve a jolly, ungrateful proletariat which thumbs its nose at him?" Carol smiled ingratiatingly to indicate that she was indeed one who desired to sacrifice, but she sighed. "I don't know. I'm afraid I'm not heroic. I certainly wasn't out home. Why didn't I do big, effective? Not a matter of heroism, matter of endurance. Your Middle West is double Puritan. Prairie Puritan on top of New England Puritan. Bluff frontiersman on the surface, but in its heart it still has the ideal of Plymouth Rock in a sleet storm. There's one attack you can make on it, perhaps the only kind that accomplishes much anywhere. You can keep on looking at one thing after another in your home and church and bank, and ask why it is, and who first laid down the law that it had to be that way. If enough of us do this impolitely enough, then we'll become civilized in merely 20,000 years or so, instead of having to wait the 200,000 years that my cynical anthropologist friends allow. Easy, pleasant, lucrative homework for wives, asking people to define their jobs. That's the most dangerous doctrine I know." Carol was mediating. "I will go back. I will go on asking questions. I've always done it, and always failed at it, and it's all I can do. I'm going to ask Ezra Stowbody why he's opposed to the nationalization of railroads, and ask Dave Dyer why a druggist always is pleased when he's called doctor, and maybe ask Mrs. Bogart why she wears a widow's veil that looks like a dead crow." The woman leader straightened. "And you have one thing. You have a baby to hug. That's my temptation. I dream of babies, of a baby, and I sneak around parks to see them playing. The children in DuPont Circle are like a poppy garden. And the Antis call me unsexed." Carol was thinking in panic, oughtn't Hugh to have country air? I won't let him become a yokel.
I can guide him away from street-corner loafing. I think I can. On her way home. Now that I've made a precedent, joined the union and gone out on one strike and learned personal solidarity, I won't be so afraid. Will won't always be resisting my running away. Someday I really will go to Europe with him, or without him. I've lived with people who are not afraid to go to jail. I could invite a Miles Bjornstam to dinner without being afraid of the Haydocks. I think I could. I'll take back the sound of Yvette Gilbert's songs and Elman's violin. They'll be only the lovelier against the thrumming of crickets in the stubble on an autumn day. I can laugh now and be serene. I think I can. Though she should return, she said, she would not be utterly defeated. She was glad of her rebellion. The prairie was no longer empty land in the sun glare. It was the living tawny beast which she had fought and made beautiful by fighting. And in the village streets were shadows of her desires and the sound of her marching and the seeds of mystery and greatness. 9. Her active hatred of Gopher Prairie had run out. She saw it now as a toiling new settlement. With sympathy, she remembered Kennicott's defense of its citizens as a lot of pretty good folks, working hard and trying to bring up their families the best they can. She recalled tenderly the young awkwardness of Main Street and the makeshifts of the little brown cottages. She pitied their shabbiness and isolation, had compassion for their assertion of culture, even as expressed in Thanatopsis papers, for their pretense of greatness, even as trumpeted in boosting. She saw Main Street in the dusty prairie sunset, a line of frontier shanties with solemn, lonely people waiting for her, solemn and lonely as an old man who has outlived his friends. She remembered that Kennicott and Sam Clark had listened to her songs, and she wanted to run to them and sing. "At last," she rejoiced, "I've come to a fairer attitude toward the town. I can love it now." She was, perhaps, rather proud of herself for having acquired so much tolerance. She awoke at 3 in the morning, after a dream of being tortured by Ella Stowbody and the widow Bogart. "I've been making the town a myth. This is how people keep up the tradition of the perfect hometown, the happy boyhood, the brilliant college friends. We forget so. I've been forgetting that Main Street doesn't think it's in the least lonely and pitiful. It thinks it's God's own country. It isn't waiting for me. It doesn't care." But the next evening she again saw Gopher Prairie as her home, waiting for her in the sunset, rimmed round with splendor. She did not return for 5 months more, 5 months crammed with greedy accumulation of sounds and colors to take back for the long still days. She had spent nearly 2 years in Washington. When she departed for Gopher Prairie in June, her second baby was stirring within her. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39. Of Main Street, by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. 1. She wondered all the way home what her sensations would be. She wondered about it so much that she had every sensation she had imagined. She was excited by each familiar porch, each hearty, "Well, well," and flattered to be, for a day, the most important news of the community. She bustled about, making calls. Juanita Haydock bubbled over their Washington encounter, and took Carol to her social bosom. This ancient opponent seemed likely to be her most intimate friend, for Vida Sherwin, though she was cordial, stood back and watched for imported heresies. In the evening, Carol went to the mill. The mystical ohm, ohm, ohm of the dynamos in the electric light plant behind the mill was louder in the darkness. Outside sat the night watchman, Champ Perry. He held up his stringy hands and squeaked, "We've all missed you terrible." Who in Washington would miss her? Who in Washington could be depended upon like Guy Pollock? When she saw him on the street, smiling as always, he seemed an eternal thing, a part of her own self. After a week,
She decided that she was neither glad nor sorry to be back. She entered each day with the matter-of-fact attitude with which she had gone to her office in Washington. It was her task. There would be mechanical details and meaningless talk. What of it? The only problem which she had approached with emotion proved insignificant. She had, on the train, worked herself up to such devotion that she was willing to give up her own room, to try to share all her life with Kennicott. He mumbled, 10 minutes after she had entered the house, "Say, I've kept your room for you like it was. I've kind of come round to your way of thinking. Don't see why folks need to get on each other's nerves just because they're friendly. Darned if I haven't got so I like a little privacy and mulling things over by myself." 2. She had left a city which sat up nights to talk of universal transition, of European revolution, guild socialism, free verse. She had fancied that all the world was changing. She found that it was not. In Gopher Prairie, the only ardent new topics were prohibition, the place in Minneapolis where you could get whiskey at $13 a quart, recipes for homemade beer, the high cost of living, the presidential election, Clark's new car, and not very novel foibles of Cy Bogart. Their problems were exactly what they had been 2 years ago, what they had been 20 years ago, and what they would be for 20 years to come. With the world a possible volcano, the husbandmen were plowing at the base of the mountain. A volcano does occasionally drop a river of lava on even the best of agriculturalists, to their astonishment and considerable injury, but their cousins inherit the farms and a year or two later go back to the plowing. She was unable to rhapsodize much over the 7 new bungalows and the 2 garages which Kennicott had made seem so important. Her intensest thought about them was, "Oh yes, they're all right, I suppose." The change which she did heed was the erection of the school building, with its cheerful brick walls, broad windows, gymnasium, classrooms for agriculture and cooking. It indicated Vida's triumph, and it stirred her to activity, any activity. She went to Vida with a jaunty, "I think I shall work for you, and I'll begin at the bottom." She did. She relieved the attendant at the restroom for an hour a day. Her only innovation was painting the pine table a black and orange rather shocking to the Thanatopsis. She talked to the farm wives and soothed their babies, and was happy. Thinking of them, she did not think of the ugliness of Main Street as she hurried along it to the chatter of the Jolly 17. She wore her eyeglasses on the street now. She was beginning to ask Kennicott and Juanita if she didn't look young, much younger than 33. Her eyeglasses pinched her nose. She considered spectacles. They would make her seem older and hopelessly settled. No, she would not wear spectacles yet. But she tried on a pair at Kennicott's office. They really were much more comfortable. 3. Dr. Westlake, Sam Clark, Nat Hicks, and Del Snafflin were talking in Del's barber shop. "Well, I see Kennicott's wife is taking a whirl at the restroom now," said Dr. Westlake. He emphasized the now. Del interrupted the shaving of Sam, and, with his brush dripping lather, he observed jocularly, "What'll she be up to next? They say she used to claim this burg wasn't swell enough for a city girl like her, and would we please tax ourselves about 37.9 and fix it all up pretty, with tatties on the hydrants and statues on the lawns?" Sam irritably blew the lather from his lips, with milky small bubbles, and snorted, "Be a good thing for most of us roughnecks if we did have a smart woman to tell us how to fix up the town. Just as much to her kicking as there was to Jim Blosser's gassing about factories. And you can bet Mrs. Kennicott is smart, even if she is skittish. Glad to see her back." Dr. Westlake hastened to play safe. "So was I, so was I. She's got a nice way about her, and she knows a good deal about books, or fiction anyway. Of course, she's like all the rest of these women, not solidly founded, not scholarly. Doesn't know anything about political economy. Falls for every new idea that some windjamming crank puts out. But she's a nice woman. She'll probably fix up the restroom, and the restroom is a fine thing. Brings a lot of business to town. And now that Mrs. Kennicott's been away, maybe she's got over some of her fool ideas.
Maybe she realizes that folks simply laugh at her when she tries to tell us how to run everything." "Sure, she'll take a tumble to herself," said Nat Hicks, sucking in his lips judicially. "As far as I'm concerned, I'll say she's as nice a looking skirt as there is in town, but yow!" His tone electrified them. "Guess she'll miss that Swede Valborg that used to work for me. They was a pair, talking poetry and moonshine. If they could have got away with it, they'd have been so darn lovey-dovey." Sam Clark interrupted. "Rats, they never even thought about making love, just talking books and all that junk. I tell you, Carrie Kennicott's a smart woman, and these smart, educated women all get funny ideas, but they get over 'em after they've had 3 or 4 kids. You'll see her settle down one of these days, and teaching Sunday school and helping at sociables and behaving herself, and not trying to butt into business and politics. Sure." After only 15 minutes of conference on her stockings, her son, her separate bedroom, her music, her ancient interest in Guy Pollock, her probable salary in Washington, and every remark which she has known to have made since her return, the Supreme Council decided that they would permit Carol Kennicott to live, and they passed on to a consideration of Nat Hicks's new one about the traveling salesman and the old maid. 4. For some reason, which was totally mysterious to Carol, Maud Dyer seemed to resent her return. At the Jolly 17, Maud giggled nervously. "Well, I suppose you found war work a good excuse to stay away and have a swell time. Juanita, don't you think we ought to make Carrie tell us about the officer she met in Washington?" They rustled and stared. Carol looked at them. Their curiosity seemed natural and unimportant. "Oh, yes, indeed. Have to do that some day," she yawned. She no longer took Aunt Bessie Smale seriously enough to struggle for independence. She saw that Aunt Bessie did not mean to intrude, that she wanted to do things for all the Kennicotts. Thus Carol hit upon the tragedy of old age, which was not that it was less vigorous than youth, but that it was not needed by youth, that its love and prosy sageness, so important a few years ago, so gladly offered now, are rejected with laughter. She divined that when Aunt Bessie came in with a jar of wild grape jelly, she was waiting in hope of being asked for the recipe. After that, she could be irritated, but she could not be depressed by Aunt Bessie's simoom of questioning. She wasn't depressed even when she heard Mrs. Bogart observe, "Now we've got Prohibition, it seems to me that the next problem of the country ain't so much abolishing cigarettes as it is to make folks observe the Sabbath and arrest these lawbreakers that play baseball and go to the movies and all on the Lord's Day." Only one thing bruised Carol's vanity. Few people asked her about Washington. They who had most admiringly begged Percy Bresnahan for his opinions were least interested in her facts. She laughed at herself when she saw that she had expected to be at once a heretic and a returned hero. She was very reasonable and merry about it, and it hurt just as much as ever. Her baby, born in August, was a girl. Carol could not decide whether she was to become a feminist leader or marry a scientist or both, but did settle on Vassar and a tricoloured suit with a small black hat for her freshman year. 6. Hugh was loquacious at breakfast. He desired to give his impression of Owls and F Street. "Don't make so much noise. You talk too much," growled Kennicott. Carol flared. "Don't speak to him that way. Why don't you listen to him? He has some very interesting things to tell." "What's the idea? Mean to say you expect me to spend all my time listening to his chatter?" "Why not?" "For one thing, he's got to learn a little discipline. Time for him to start getting educated." "I've learned much more discipline, I've had much more education from him than he has from me." "What's this? Some newfangled idea of raising kids you got in Washington?" "Perhaps. Did you ever realize that children are people?" "That's all right. I'm not going to have him monopolizing the conversation." "No, of course. We have our rights, too. But I'm going to bring him up as a human being. He has just as many thoughts as we have, and I want him to develop them, not take Gopher Prairie's version of them. That's my biggest work now, keeping you from educating him."
Well, let's not scrap about it, but I'm not going to have him spoiled." Kennicott had forgotten it in 10 minutes, and she forgot it this time. 7. The Kennicotts and the Sam Clarks had driven north to a duck pass between two lakes, on an autumn day of blue and copper. Kennicott had given her a light 20-gauge shotgun. She had a first lesson in shooting, in keeping her eyes open, not wincing, understanding that the head at the beat of the barrel really had something to do with pointing the gun. She was radiant. She almost believed Sam when he insisted that it was she who had shot the mallard at which they had fired together. She sat on the bank of the reedy lake and found rest in Mrs. Clark's drawling comments on nothing. The brown dusk was still. Behind them were dark marshes. The plowed acres smelled fresh. The lake was garnet and silver. The voices of the men, waiting for the last flight, were clear in the cool air. "Mark left," sang Kennicott in a long-drawn call. 3 ducks were swooping down in a swift line. The guns banged, and a duck fluttered. The men pushed their light boat out on the burnished lake, disappeared beyond the reeds. Their cheerful voices and the slow splash and clank of oars came back to Carol from the dimness. In the sky, a fiery plain sloped down to a serene harbor. It dissolved. The lake was white marble, and Kennicott was crying, "Well, old lady, how about hiking out for home? Supper tastes pretty good, eh?" "I'll sit back with Ethel," she said at the car. It was the first time she had called Mrs. Clark by her given name, the first time she had willingly sat back, a woman of Main Street. "I'm hungry. It's good to be hungry," she reflected, as they drove away. She looked across the silent fields to the west. She was conscious of an unbroken sweep of land to the Rockies, to Alaska, a dominion which will rise to unexampled greatness when other empires have grown senile. Before that time, she knew, 100 generations of Carols will aspire and go down in tragedy, devoid of palls and solemn chanting, the humdrum, inevitable tragedy of struggle against inertia. "Let's all go to the movies tomorrow night. Awfully exciting film," said Ethel Clark. "Well, I was going to read a new book, but—" "All right, let's go," said Carol. 8. "They're too much for me," Carol sighed to Kennicott. "I've been thinking about getting up an annual community day when the whole town would forget feuds and go out and have sports and a picnic and a dance. But Bert Tybee, why did you ever elect him mayor? He's kidnapped my idea. He wants the community day, but he wants to have some politician give an address. That's just the stilted sort of thing I've tried to avoid. He asked Vida, and of course she agreed with him." Kennicott considered the matter while he wound the clock, and they tramped upstairs. "Yes, it would jar you to have Bert butting in," he said amiably. "Are you going to do much fussing over this community stunt? Don't you ever get tired of fretting and stewing and experimenting?" "I haven't even started. Look." She led him to the nursery door, pointed at the fuzzy brown head of her daughter. "Do you see that object on the pillow? Do you know what it is? It's a bomb to blow up smugness. If you Tories were wise, you wouldn't arrest anarchists. You'd arrest all these children while they're asleep in their cribs. Think what that baby will see and meddle with before she dies in the year 2000. She may see an industrial union of the whole world. She may see aeroplanes going to Mars." "Yup, probably be changes all right," yawned Kennicott. She sat on the edge of his bed while he hunted through his bureau for a collar which ought to be there and persistently wasn't. "I'll go on always. And I am happy. But this community day makes me see how thoroughly I'm beaten." "That darn collar certainly is gone for keeps," muttered Kennicott, and louder, "Yes, I guess I didn't quite catch what you said, dear." She patted his pillows, turned down his sheets, as she reflected, "But I have won in this. I've never excused my failures by sneering at my aspirations, by pretending to have gone beyond them. I do not admit that Main Street is as beautiful as it should be. I do not admit that Gopher Prairie is greater or more generous than Europe. I do not admit that dishwashing is enough to satisfy all women. I may not have fought the good fight, but I have kept the faith." "Sure, you bet you have," said Kennicott. "Well, good night. Sort of feels to me like it might snow tomorrow. Have to be thinking about putting up the storm windows pretty soon. Say, did you notice whether the girl put that screwdriver back?" The End of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.